Welcome, weary traveller, to the tale of Dutch van der Linde, a story not of heroes and villains in simple opposition, but of idealism corrupted, philosophy twisted into justification, and the slow transformation of a dreamer into the very thing he once claimed to oppose. Tonight, we journey through the rise and fall of a man whose silver tongue could inspire loyalty unto death, whose grand vision of freedom became a cage for those who loved him most. Settle into the darkness, let your breathing slow, and witness how even the noblest intentions can be poisoned by pride, paranoia, and the inability to admit when one's time has passed. The man who would become Dutch van der Linde entered this world in the year 1855, born to a woman named Greta van der Linde in the industrial shadows near Philadelphia, where the smoke of progress already hung heavy in the air, and the promises of America seemed both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant for those without the proper connections or inherited advantages that determine so much about what a life might become in that era of rapid transformation and social upheaval. His father, whose name has been lost to the kind of historical silence that swallows the stories of ordinary men who die in service of causes larger than themselves, was a man of Dutch ancestry who possessed whatever combination of courage and desperation drove him to answer his adopted country's call when the great conflict between North and South tore the nation apart along lines that had been drawn long before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The boy who would grow up to preach about the evils of government and the corruption of authority learned his first lessons about the cost of institutional loyalty when his father marched away to fight for the Union cause and never returned, leaving behind only the kind of official notification that reduced a man's entire existence to a few lines of bureaucratic text informing his widow that her husband had died in battle while serving his country with honor and distinction. The irony that would later define so much of Dutch's relationship with the world around him was already present in those early days, as the child who lost his father to governmental authority would eventually develop a philosophical framework that rejected such authority, while simultaneously craving the kind of power and influence that his father had died serving. Greta van der Linde was not a woman equipped by circumstance or temperament to raise a strong-willed boy whose father's absence had created a hunger for male authority that she could neither understand nor satisfy. And the household that young Dutch inhabited during his formative years was characterized by the kind of low-level conflict that emerges when two people who love each other lack the tools necessary for effective communication about their deepest needs and fears. The mother who had lost her husband to war was struggling with her own grief and anger while trying to provide stability for a son whose rebellious nature seemed to grow stronger with each passing year, as if he were unconsciously testing every boundary she attempted to establish in order to discover whether she, like his father, might also disappear if pushed too far. The education that Dutch received during these early years was inconsistent and fragmented, shaped more by his own voracious appetite for knowledge than by any systematic attempt to provide him with the kind of comprehensive learning that children of more prosperous families took for granted. Yet this haphazard approach to intellectual development may have contributed to the formation of the questioning mind and independent thinking that would later characterize both his greatest strengths and his most dangerous weaknesses as a leader of men and shaper of destinies. The books that found their way into his hands during those years of intellectual hunger were eclectic collections of philosophy, history, and literature that gave him exposure to ideas about freedom, justice, and social organization that formal schooling might never have provided. By his teenage years, Dutch had developed into exactly the kind of young man that respectable society viewed with suspicion and concern, intelligent enough to see through the comfortable lies that kept most people content with their assigned places in the social hierarchy, yet lacking the kind of constructive outlet for his energy and idealism that might have channeled his rebellious instincts toward positive social change rather than personal rebellion against every form of authority he encountered. The arguments between mother and son grew more frequent and more bitter as Dutch's contempt for conventional expectations became impossible for Greta to ignore or rationalize away, while his increasing absences from home made it clear that he was seeking elsewhere the kind of purpose and belonging that family life had failed to provide. The decision to leave home at the age of 15 was not the dramatic break that romantic accounts of outlaw origins might suggest, but rather the inevitable conclusion of a gradual process of separation that had been developing for years as Dutch's need for independence collided with his mother's desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of family unity in the face of forces that neither of them fully understood or could effectively control. The morning when Dutch walked away from the only home he had ever known was marked not by angry words or dramatic confrontations, but by the kind of sad recognition that comes when two people who love each other finally acknowledge that they have grown too far apart to bridge the distance that circumstances and character have created between them. The years that followed Dutch's departure from home were characterized by the kind of hand-to-mouth existence that taught him valuable lessons about survival, self-reliance, and the harsh realities of life for those who existed on the margins of respectable society, while simultaneously providing him with first-hand experience of the casual cruelty and systematic oppression that characterized the treatment of the poor, the rootless, and the unwanted by those who possessed wealth and social position. The young man who wandered from town to town in search of work, shelter, and purpose was gradually developing the worldview that would later find expression in his philosophy of resistance against established authority and his identification with society's outcasts and victims. The education that Dutch received during these wandering years was provided not by formal institutions, but by the hard experience of learning how to read people's motivations and weaknesses, how to identify opportunities for profit in the grey areas between legal and illegal activity, and how to present himself in ways that would inspire trust and confidence in those whose cooperation or assistance he needed for survival. The natural charisma and intellectual gifts that would later make him such an effective leader of men were being refined and developed through daily practice in the arts of persuasion, manipulation, and social navigation that characterized life among the drifters, con artists, and small-time criminals who inhabited the shadowy world he had entered. It was during this period of education in the University of Hard Experience that Dutch encountered the ideas about anarchism, social justice, and individual freedom that would provide the philosophical foundation for everything he would later claim to represent, though the process by which he absorbed and synthesized these concepts was more intuitive than systematic, shaped by his emotional responses to the inequities he witnessed and experienced, rather than by careful study of the political theorists and social critics who had developed more sophisticated analyses of the problems he was beginning to identify. The young man who was learning to see society as fundamentally corrupt and oppressive was also learning to justify his own criminal activities as forms of rebellion rather than simple theft. The transformation of Dutch van der Linde from angry young man to criminal philosopher was not accomplished overnight, but rather through a gradual process of rationalization and idealization that allowed him to maintain his self-respect while engaging in activities that his earlier moral training would have condemned, creating the psychological foundation for the complex mixture of genuine idealism and self-serving justification that would characterize his approach to leadership throughout his adult life. The thefts and cons that provided him with the money necessary for survival were reimagined as acts of redistribution from those who had more than they deserved, to someone who was simply claiming his fair share of the wealth that an unjust system had denied him. By the middle of the 1870s, Dutch had evolved from a simple rebel without direction into something approaching a criminal with principles, though the exact nature of those principles remained fluid enough to accommodate whatever actions his immediate circumstances seemed to require for survival and advancement. The young man who had once fought with his mother about staying out past dark was now someone who viewed conventional morality as a tool used by the powerful to control the powerless, while seeing his own criminal activities as expressions of a higher form of justice that transcended the narrow legalities that bound less enlightened individuals to lives of quiet desperation and unfulfilled potential. It was during this crucial period of intellectual and moral development that fate, or perhaps simple statistical probability, brought Dutch into contact with the man who would become both his closest friend and his most important collaborator in the great work of building something that resembled a criminal organization but claimed to serve purposes far nobler than simple profit or personal aggrandizement. Hosea Matthews was older, more experienced, and possessed of the kind of practical wisdom that comes from years of successful survival in dangerous circumstances. Yet, he was also someone who had retained enough idealism to find Dutch's vision of principled outlawry both attractive and potentially achievable under the right circumstances and with proper planning. The partnership that developed between Dutch and Hosea was characterized from its earliest days by a productive tension between Dutch's grand vision and Hosea's pragmatic approach to the daily challenges of criminal life, with each man contributing essential elements that neither could have provided alone, while gradually developing the kind of trust and mutual respect that would sustain them through decades of shared danger and collective achievement. Dutch provided the philosophical framework and charismatic leadership that could inspire others to join their cause and maintain loyalty during difficult periods, while Hosea contributed the practical skills and strategic thinking that transformed idealistic dreams into achievable goals. The Van der Linde gang that emerged from this partnership was unlike other criminal organizations of the period in ways that reflected both the genuine idealism and the sophisticated self-deception that characterized its founders' approach to their chosen profession, as they developed elaborate justifications for their activities that allowed them to maintain their self-image as social reformers, rather than simple predators, while simultaneously ensuring that their operations remained profitable, enough to sustain the kind of lifestyle that attracted new recruits and maintained the loyalty of existing members. The robberies and cons that provided their primary source of income were carefully selected to target individuals and institutions that could be portrayed as representatives of the corrupt system they claimed to oppose. The early success of the Van der Linde gang was based not merely on the complementary skills of its founders, but on their ability to create a sense of purpose and belonging that attracted individuals who might otherwise have struggled to find their place in conventional society, while providing them with both practical benefits and ideological justification for activities that helped them survive and prosper in a world that seemed designed to crush anyone who lacked the advantages of birth or the willingness to compromise their principles for material gain. The gang became a refuge for society's misfits and outcasts, united by shared rejection of conventional values and common commitment to Dutch's vision of noble outlawry. The reputation that Dutch and Hosea built during these early years was carefully cultivated to emphasize their principled approach to criminal activity and their genuine concern for the welfare of those they claimed to represent, while minimizing public awareness of the violence and moral compromise that inevitably accompanied their operations, and was beginning to reveal the gap between Dutch's noble rhetoric and the ugly realities of maintaining a criminal organization in a world where law enforcement agencies were becoming increasingly sophisticated and determined to bring such groups to justice. The romantic image of the gentleman outlaw was becoming harder to sustain as the stakes grew higher and the methods required for survival became more brutal and morally questionable. The transformation of Dutch van der Linde from successful criminal partnership into something resembling a father figure and philosophical guide began with the discovery of a 14-year-old boy whose circumstances were so desperate and whose need for belonging was so profound that he represented the perfect candidate for the kind of ideological molding that Dutch had begun to envision as the next stage in his evolution, from simple outlaw to leader of a movement that might someday challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which American society had constructed its systems of bekas, power and control. Arthur Morgan was not merely another recruit to be added to their growing organization, but rather the first test of Dutch's theory that young minds could be shaped according to principles that transcended the narrow self-interest that motivated most criminal activity, creating individuals whose loyalty would be based not on fear or greed, but on genuine belief in the righteousness of their shared cause. The circumstances that brought Arthur into Dutch's orbit were the kind of tragic combination of abandonment and desperation that characterized the lives of so many children during that period of rapid social change and economic upheaval, when traditional family structures were being destroyed by industrial development and westward migration, while new forms of social support had not yet emerged to replace the extended kinship networks that had once provided security for the young and vulnerable. Arthur's father had vanished from his life when the boy was still young enough to believe that adult promises meant something, leaving behind only vague memories and the kind of psychological wound that creates a hunger for male authority and guidance that would shape every important relationship that followed. Arthur's mother had struggled valiantly to provide for her son in the years following his father's abandonment, working whatever jobs were available to women of her class and circumstances, while trying to maintain the kind of stable home environment that child development required. Yet the grinding poverty and social isolation that characterized their daily existence gradually wore away her health and her hope, until death claimed her with the casual indifference that the 19th century displayed toward those who lacked access to proper medical care or adequate nutrition. The boy who stood beside his mother's grave possessed nothing but the clothes on his back and a premature understanding of loss that had already begun to shape his character in ways that would make him both an ideal candidate for Dutch's experiment in ideological education and a young man whose capacity for loyalty would prove both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. The moment when Dutch and Hosea encountered Arthur represented one of those convergences of need and opportunity that seemed to suggest the operation of forces larger than mere chance, as the two experienced outlaws recognized in the grieving boy not merely another mouth to feed, but a potential disciple whose youth and desperate circumstances made him perfectly suited for the kind of comprehensive indoctrination that could transform a lost child into a devoted follower who would never question the fundamental assumptions upon which their shared enterprise was based. Dutch saw in Arthur the raw material from which he could craft a true believer, someone whose loyalty would be based not on calculation or expedience, but on genuine gratitude and carefully cultivated identification with the principles and purposes that justified their way of life. The process by which Arthur was integrated into the van der Linde gang was not the brutal initiation that characterized most criminal organizations, but rather a carefully orchestrated campaign of kindness, instruction, and gradual revelation that allowed Dutch to establish himself as the father figure that Arthur had never possessed, while simultaneously shaping the boy's understanding of right and wrong, according to the philosophical framework that Dutch had developed to justify his own choices and aspirations. The education that Arthur received during these crucial formative years went far beyond the practical skills of survival and criminal activity, to include exposure to ideas about justice, freedom, and social responsibility that most children of his background would never encounter. Dutch's approach to Arthur's moral education was characterized by the kind of sophisticated manipulation that disguised itself as genuine care and concern, as he provided the boy with books to read and ideas to consider, while carefully guiding his interpretation of these materials in directions that supported the ideological framework that justified their criminal activities and reinforced Arthur's dependence upon Dutch's wisdom and guidance. The philosophical discussions that took place around their campfires during Arthur's teenage years were designed to appear as free exchanges of ideas, while actually serving to reinforce Dutch's authority as teacher and guide, while gradually building Arthur's commitment to principles that would make him willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of their shared cause. The success of Dutch's experiment with Arthur encouraged him to believe that his theories about ideological education and character formation were not merely self-serving rationalizations, but genuine insights into human nature that could be applied more broadly to create a community of individuals whose commitment to their shared enterprise would transcend the narrow self-interest that bound together most criminal organizations. The boy who had been rescued from destitution and despair had indeed been transformed into someone whose loyalty and dedication exceeded anything that money or fear could have purchased, proving to Dutch's satisfaction that his methods were both effective and morally justified despite their manipulative foundation. The addition of John Marston to their growing family 2 years later provided Dutch with another opportunity to test and refine his techniques for molding young minds, according to his vision of what criminal nobility should represent. Though John's personality and circumstances presented different challenges that required modifications to the approach that had worked so effectively with Arthur. Where Arthur had been eager to please and desperately hungry for the kind of stable authority that Dutch provided, John was more naturally rebellious and independent, requiring a different combination of guidance and freedom that would allow his spirit to develop, while still ensuring his ultimate loyalty to Dutch's leadership and philosophy. John's background was similar enough to Arthur's to make him another ideal candidate for Dutch's experiment in alternative family structure, yet different enough in crucial details to provide Dutch with insights into the variables that affected the success of his methods and the types of personalities that were most susceptible to his particular form of ideological seduction. The 12-year-old boy who joined their organization had already developed defense mechanisms and survival instincts that made him less malleable than Arthur had been, requiring Dutch to employ more subtle and sophisticated techniques to achieve the kind of psychological transformation that would create genuine loyalty rather than mere compliance. The dynamic that developed between Arthur and John during their shared adolescence within Dutch's makeshift family was characterized by the kind of sibling rivalry and mutual affection that emerges when two young people compete for the attention and approval of the same father figure, while simultaneously supporting each other through the challenges and dangers of their unconventional upbringing. Dutch was careful to manage this relationship in ways that reinforced his own centrality to their emotional lives, while preventing either boy from developing the kind of independent bond that might have provided them with alternative sources of identity and purpose that could threaten their dependence upon his guidance and approval. The education that both boys received under Dutch's tutelage was far more comprehensive than anything available to children of their social class through conventional channels, as Dutch made sure they learned to read and write while also exposing them to literature, philosophy, and political theory that would provide the intellectual foundation for understanding and articulating the principles that justified their way of life. The library that traveled with the gang included works by authors whose ideas about individual freedom and social justice could be selectively quoted and interpreted to support Dutch's worldview while providing his young disciples with the vocabulary and conceptual framework necessary for defending their choices to themselves and others. The practical skills that Arthur and John acquired during their teenage years went far beyond the obvious requirements of criminal activity to include everything from tracking and hunting to basic medical care and mechanical repair, creating a comprehensive skill set that made them valuable contributors to the gang's operations, while also ensuring that they would have difficulty surviving independently should they ever choose to leave the only family they had, known since childhood. Dutch was careful to create a situation where loyalty was reinforced by practical dependence as well as emotional attachment, making defection not merely psychologically difficult, but genuinely dangerous to their survival and well-being. The success that Dutch achieved in molding Arthur and John according to his vision encouraged him to expand his experiment to include other young people whose circumstances made them suitable candidates for his particular form of salvation and indoctrination, leading to the recruitment of individuals like Lenny Summers and Sean Maguire, whose intelligence and idealism made them eager converts to Dutch's philosophy, while their youth and inexperience made them unlikely to question the contradictions and hypocrisies that more mature observers might have noticed in the gap between Dutch's noble rhetoric and their actual activities. Lenny Summers represented perhaps the most promising of these later recruits, as his natural intelligence and genuine passion for learning made him an enthusiastic student of Dutch's philosophical teachings, while his personal experiences with racial prejudice and social exclusion provided him with first-hand knowledge of the systemic injustices that Dutch claimed their activities were designed to combat. The young man who joined the gang as a teenager brought with him not only enthusiasm for their cause, but also insights and perspectives that enriched Dutch's understanding of the broader social forces they were supposedly fighting against. Sean Maguire's recruitment provided Dutch with a different type of follower, someone whose natural charisma and rebellious energy could be channeled into service of their shared enterprise, while his Irish background and experiences with ethnic discrimination gave him personal reasons for identifying with Dutch's rhetoric about standing against oppressive authority and fighting for the rights of society's outcasts. The combination of Sean's humor and John's intensity with Arthur's steady reliability and Lenny's intellectual gifts created a dynamic within the gang that Dutch could orchestrate to maximum effect while ensuring that no individual relationship became strong enough to challenge his central role as leader and guide. The expansion of their organization to include older and more experienced individuals like Bill Williamson required Dutch to modify his approach while maintaining the fundamental principle that loyalty should be based on ideological commitment rather than simple material self-interest. Though the practical realities of managing diverse personalities with different backgrounds and motivations created challenges that tested Dutch's skills as both leader and psychologist. Bill's military background and need for structure made him responsive to Dutch's authoritarian leadership style, while his limited intellectual capacity made him unlikely to question the philosophical inconsistencies that might have troubled more thoughtful individuals. Charles Smith's eventual integration into the gang represented a particular triumph for Dutch's recruitment methods, as Charles possessed both the practical skills and moral integrity that made him valuable as an operational asset, while his mixed racial heritage and experiences with social exclusion gave him personal reasons for identifying with Dutch's stated mission of fighting against systematic oppression. The respect that Charles commanded from other gang members because of his competence and character provided Dutch with additional legitimacy, while Charles's quiet nature prevented him from becoming a rival source of moral authority within the organization. Javier Escuela's recruitment offered Dutch an opportunity to demonstrate the international relevance of his philosophy, while adding someone whose revolutionary background and experiences with political persecution provided authentic credentials for their claimed status as freedom fighters, rather than simple criminals. Javier's genuine gratitude for the sanctuary and purpose that the gang provided, combined with his natural loyalty and military skills, made him one of Dutch's most devoted followers, while his exotic background added an element of romantic internationalism to their collective identity. The women who gradually joined the gang presented Dutch with different challenges and opportunities, as their presence helped to create the family atmosphere that was essential to his vision of their organization, while their complex roles within the hierarchy reflected both Dutch's genuine care for society's outcasts and his limitations in imagining alternatives to conventional gender relationships. Susan Grimshaw's transformation from working girl to camp administrator provided Dutch with essential organizational support, while her fierce loyalty and natural authority helped maintain discipline and cohesion within their growing community. Abigail Roberts' integration into the gang through her relationship with John created complications that Dutch had to manage carefully, as her presence introduced questions about family formation and long-term planning that challenged some of the assumptions upon which his leadership was based. While her practical nature and maternal instincts provided stabilizing influences that benefited the entire organization, the birth of Jack Marston represented both the ultimate expression of the family ideal that Dutch claimed to champion and a potential threat to the nomadic lifestyle that their criminal activities required. The delicate ecosystem of personalities and relationships that Dutch assembled during these years of expansion and consolidation represented his greatest achievement as a leader and organizer, creating a community that combined the practical advantages of criminal cooperation with the emotional satisfactions of family belonging, while maintaining ideological coherence through shared commitment to principles that elevated their activities above mere self-interested predation. The loyalty that bound these diverse individuals together was not based solely on fear or greed, but on genuine affection and shared belief in the righteousness of their cause. The golden years of the Van der Linde gang, roughly spanning the period from the early 1880s through the middle of the 1890s, represented the closest that Dutch ever came to achieving his vision of what criminal nobility should look like, as their operations became increasingly sophisticated and profitable, while maintaining enough connection to their stated principles to allow all members to feel proud of their association with an organization that seemed to represent something more meaningful than simple lawlessness. The bank and train robberies that provided their primary source of income were planned and executed with a level of professionalism that minimized unnecessary violence, while maximizing both financial return and symbolic impact. The reputation that the gang built during these peak years was carefully cultivated to emphasize their Robin Hood aspects while downplaying the inevitable violence and moral compromise that accompanied their activities, creating a public image that attracted both new recruits and tacit support from communities that had legitimate grievances against the banks and railroad companies that were their primary targets. Dutch's natural showmanship and gift for dramatic gesture helped create legends and stories that spread far beyond the immediate locations of their operations, building a mythology that served both recruitment and operational security purposes. The internal dynamics of the gang during this period were characterized by the kind of productive tension between individual personalities and collective purpose that Dutch had always envisioned as the ideal foundation for their community, with each member contributing unique skills and perspectives, while maintaining loyalty to the shared vision that justified their unconventional lifestyle. The debates and discussions that took place around their campfires during evening gatherings served both educational and entertainment purposes, while reinforcing the intellectual framework that distinguished them from common criminals. Yet even during these years of greatest success and apparent harmony, careful observers might have noticed signs of the problems that would eventually destroy everything Dutch had built. As the contradictions between his noble rhetoric and their practical necessities became increasingly difficult to reconcile, while the personal dynamics that held the group together began to show signs of strain under the pressure of maintaining criminal operations in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to their way of life. The very success that Dutch had achieved in creating loyalty through ideological indoctrination was beginning to create expectations and standards that their actual activities could not consistently meet. The seeds of future tragedy were already present in the psychological mechanisms that Dutch had employed to build his organization, as the techniques that had proven so effective in creating devoted followers had also created individuals whose capacity for independent moral judgment had been systematically undermined by years of training to defer to Dutch's wisdom and authority on all important questions about right and wrong. The young men who had been rescued from desperate circumstances and given purpose and belonging had also been made psychologically dependent upon Dutch's approval in ways that would make it difficult for them to recognize or resist the gradual corruption of the principles they had been taught to value above their own lives. The serpent that would ultimately poison the garden that Dutch van der Linde had spent decades cultivating arrived in their midst not through any grand scheme or elaborate deception, but through the kind of chance encounter that demonstrates how the most catastrophic changes in human affairs often emerge from seemingly insignificant moments when circumstances align in ways that no amount of planning or wisdom could have anticipated or prevented. Micah Bell was not seeking the van der Linde gang when fate brought him into Dutch's orbit, nor was Dutch actively recruiting the kind of individual that Micah represented. Yet the convergence of their paths would prove to be the single most destructive event in the long history of their organization, setting in motion a chain of consequences that would eventually destroy everything that Dutch claimed to value most deeply about the life he had built and the principles he had spent so many years trying to embody and defend. The circumstances that led to Micah's integration into the gang were deceptively heroic, as Dutch's life had indeed been saved through Micah's intervention during what should have been a routine encounter with local law enforcement that had escalated beyond anyone's expectations or ability to control through normal means. The debt of gratitude that Dutch felt he owed to someone who had risked his own safety to preserve Dutch's life created an obligation that Dutch's personal code of honor made impossible to ignore or minimize. Even though every instinct and piece of accumulated wisdom about human nature should have warned him that Micah Bell represented exactly the kind of individual whose presence would undermine everything that made their organization different from and superior to the common criminal gangs that infested the American frontier during that period of social transition and institutional weakness. Micah Bell was a career criminal in the most fundamental and unredeemable sense of that term, someone whose approach to life was characterized not by the principled rebellion against unjust authority that Dutch had spent years developing and refining into a coherent worldview, but rather by the kind of pure nihilism that recognized no moral constraints or higher purposes beyond the immediate satisfaction of personal desires, and the accumulation of whatever material advantages could be obtained through the application of violence and intimidation to those who possessed what he wanted or who stood in the way of his ambitions. Where Dutch had constructed an elaborate philosophical framework to justify and ennoble his criminal activities, Micah possessed no such pretensions or internal need for moral rationalization. The fundamental incompatibility between Micah's worldview and the principles that supposedly guided the Van der Linde gang should have been immediately apparent to anyone with even minimal experience in evaluating character and motivation. Yet Dutch's psychological blind spot regarding his supposed savior prevented him from recognizing what every other member of their organization could see with perfect clarity from the moment Micah joined their ranks. The man who had spent years developing sophisticated techniques for identifying potential recruits, whose personalities and backgrounds made them suitable candidates for integration into their alternative family structure, somehow failed to apply those same analytical skills to someone whose presence threatened to undermine everything he had worked to build. Arthur Morgan's instinctive dislike of Micah was not based on petty jealousy or resistance to change within their established hierarchy, but rather on the kind of deep moral recognition that occurs when someone whose character has been shaped by genuine principles encounters another person whose fundamental nature represents everything they have been trained to oppose and resist. The hostility that characterized Arthur's relationship with Micah from their first meeting was not a personality conflict that might be resolved through better communication or shared experiences, but rather an inevitable consequence of the collision between two completely incompatible approaches to life and moral reasoning that made peaceful coexistence within the same organization psychologically impossible. Hosea Matthews, whose decades of experience in evaluating human nature and predicting behavior patterns had made him Dutch's most trusted advisor on matters of recruitment and personnel management, expressed reservations about Micah's integration into their organization that were based not on abstract philosophical concerns, but on practical observations about how Micah's presence was already beginning to affect the delicate balance of relationships and shared purposes that held their community together. The old man who had helped Dutch build their organization from nothing into something resembling a functional alternative to conventional social structures understood intuitively that Micah represented an existential threat to everything they had accomplished. The other members of the gang, despite their varying backgrounds and levels of education, demonstrated remarkable unanimity in their assessment of Micah's character and the danger he represented to their collective welfare, yet their warnings and expressions of concern were systematically ignored or dismissed by Dutch as evidence of narrow-mindedness or inability to see past surface impressions to recognize deeper qualities that supposedly justified his peace and confidence in Micah's potential contributions to their shared enterprise. The democratic instincts that Dutch had always claimed to value as essential elements of their organization's moral superiority over conventional authoritarian structures were suddenly abandoned when they produced conclusions that conflicted with his personal determination to honor his debt to Micah. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Dutch to maintain his faith in Micah, despite overwhelming evidence of the man's fundamental incompatibility with their stated principles, revealed aspects of Dutch's character that had remained hidden during the earlier years when circumstances had made it relatively easy to maintain consistency between his noble rhetoric and their actual operations. The flexibility that had once enabled Dutch to adapt his methods to changing circumstances while preserving the essential spirit of their mission was beginning to transform into something closer to intellectual dishonesty as he deployed his considerable rhetorical skills to rationalize decisions that could not be justified through honest application of the moral framework he had spent years developing and teaching to others. Micah's approach to their criminal activities was characterized by the kind of casual cruelty and disregard for innocent life that represented everything Dutch claimed to oppose in his criticisms of conventional criminal organizations. Yet somehow these obvious contradictions with their stated principles were reinterpreted by Dutch as evidence of Micah's superior understanding of the harsh realities that their idealistic philosophizing had failed to adequately acknowledge or address. The violence that Micah employed not as a last resort or necessary tool for achieving larger purposes, but as a preferred method for solving problems and expressing his contempt for anyone who stood in his way, was gradually normalized within their organization as Dutch found ways to justify or excuse behavior that should have resulted in immediate expulsion. The corruption that Micah introduced into their community was not limited to his personal actions or individual moral failings, but extended to the systematic erosion of the standards and expectations that had previously governed their collective behavior and defined their identity as something more than simply another gang of predators feeding on society's bends, weakness, and vulnerability. The discussions that had once taken place around their campfires about justice, freedom, and moral responsibility were gradually replaced by cynical exchanges about tactical advantages and operational efficiency that reflected Micah's reductive approach to questions that Dutch had once insisted required sophisticated philosophical analysis and careful ethical consideration. The influence that Micah began to exert over Dutch's decision-making process was subtle at first, expressed not through direct challenges to Dutch's authority or obvious attempts to usurp his leadership role, but rather through the kind of skillful manipulation that reinforced Dutch's existing biases and psychological needs, while gradually steering him toward conclusions that served Micah's interests rather than the collective welfare of their organization. The flattery and validation that Micah provided were carefully calculated to appeal to Dutch's vanity and his deep-seated need for recognition of his superior wisdom and moral authority, creating a psychological dependence that made Dutch increasingly resistant to contrary opinions or alternative perspectives. The practical consequences of Micah's growing influence became apparent in the changing nature of their operations, as the careful planning and attention to minimizing innocent casualties that had once characterized their approach to criminal activity gave way to more reckless and violent methods that prioritized immediate results over long-term consequences or consistency with their stated moral principles. The bank and train robberies that had once been executed with something approaching professional pride and ethical constraint became exercises in intimidation and brutality that left behind trails of trauma and suffering that no amount of philosophical rationalization could transform into expressions of social justice or revolutionary resistance. The Blackwater ferry heist that would ultimately destroy everything Dutch had built represented the perfect convergence of all the destructive forces that Micah's presence had introduced into their organization, as his influence over Dutch's decision-making, combined with Dutch's growing inability to acknowledge or correct his own errors in judgment, to produce a catastrophe that revealed the complete breakdown of the moral and practical constraints that had once made their criminal activities distinguishable from simple predation and terrorism. The planning process for this operation demonstrated how thoroughly Micah had succeeded in poisoning Dutch's relationship with those advisors whose wisdom and experience had previously served as safeguards against exactly this kind of reckless overreach. Arthur and Hosea had developed an alternative plan for a confidence scheme that would have provided substantial financial benefit while maintaining their reputation for sophisticated professionalism and avoiding the kind of direct confrontation with law enforcement that was likely to result in casualties and increased scrutiny from agencies with the resources and determination necessary to track them across state lines and through multiple jurisdictions. Their proposal represented exactly the kind of carefully calculated operation that had built their reputation and sustained their organization through years of successful criminal activity, yet it was abandoned in favor of Micah's more aggressive approach that prioritized immediate gratification over long-term strategic thinking. The psychological dynamics that led Dutch to choose Micah's counsel over the advice of individuals whose loyalty and wisdom had been proven through decades of shared experience and mutual trust revealed how completely his judgment had been compromised by his need to justify the decision to integrate Micah into their organization despite overwhelming evidence of its destructive consequences. The intellectual honesty that had once enabled Dutch to acknowledge and learn from his mistakes was gradually being replaced by a defensive stubbornness that interpreted any criticism or alternative suggestion as a personal attack on his pains, authority, and competence as a leader. The ferry heist itself unfolded according to the predictable logic of poorly planned operations conducted by individuals whose commitment to violence as a problem-solving tool had overcome their capacity for strategic thinking and moral constraint, resulting in the kind of chaotic bloodbath that accomplished nothing beyond the temporary acquisition of money while destroying lives, relationships, and reputations that had taken years to build and could never be adequately repaired or replaced. The innocent people who died during the operation were not acceptable casualties in some larger struggle for justice, but rather victims of Dutch's inability to maintain the moral standards that had once distinguished his organization from common criminal gangs. The killing of Heidi McCourt represented the ultimate expression of how thoroughly Micah's influence had corrupted Dutch's moral reasoning, as the murder of an innocent young woman was somehow rationalized as a necessary action rather than recognized as the kind of evil act that their entire philosophical framework had been constructed to oppose and prevent. The fact that Micah had encouraged this killing while Dutch had carried it out revealed the complex interplay of influence and responsibility that made both men culpable for an act that violated everything their organization had supposedly stood for during its years of principled criminal activity. The immediate aftermath of Blackwater demonstrated that the psychological and moral damage that Micah had inflicted upon their organization extended far beyond the tactical failures and operational disasters that had made their position untenable, as Dutch's response to criticism and questioning about the events revealed his complete inability to acknowledge responsibility for decisions that had resulted in the deaths of gang members and innocent bystanders while accomplishing nothing of value for anyone involved. The deflection and blame-shifting that characterized Dutch's attempts to explain what had happened showed how thoroughly his capacity for honest self-reflection had been undermined by his need to maintain his self-image as a wise and principled leader. The flight into the mountains that followed the Blackwater massacre was not merely a tactical retreat designed to evade immediate pursuit, but rather a symbolic journey into the kind of moral wilderness that Dutch's organization had once existed to oppose, as they found themselves reduced to simple survival concerns. While the philosophical framework that had once provided meaning and purpose for their activities crumbled under the weight of contradictions that could no longer be rationalized or ignored, the gang that emerged from their mountain exile would bear only superficial resemblance to the principled community that had entered it, as fundamental relationships of trust and mutual respect had been damaged beyond repair by the revelation of what Dutch was willing to sacrifice for the sake of maintaining his position and avoiding accountability for his failures. The patterns of denial, deflection, and increasingly desperate rationalization that Dutch displayed during the weeks following Blackwater would characterize his response to every subsequent crisis and challenge, as his psychological defense mechanisms evolved from temporary expedients designed to preserve morale during difficult periods into permanent features of his personality that made genuine learning or moral growth impossible. The man who had once been capable of acknowledging and correcting his errors had been transformed by Micah's influence and his own pride into someone whose primary concern was protecting his self-image rather than serving the welfare of those who depended upon his leadership. The seeds of paranoia and persecution complex that would eventually consume Dutch's capacity for rational judgment were already beginning to sprout during these early weeks of exile, as his inability to accept responsibility for the Blackwater disaster created a psychological need to identify external enemies and internal traitors who could be blamed for failures that were actually the predictable consequences of his own poor decisions and moral compromises. The collaborative decision-making process that had once characterized their organization was gradually being replaced by an authoritarian structure that brooked no dissent or alternative perspectives while demanding absolute loyalty to Dutch's increasingly erratic and self-serving interpretations of their circumstances and options. The descent into madness that would ultimately consume Dutch van der Linde's capacity for rational judgment and moral reasoning did not begin with the dramatic collapse that observers might have expected from such a catastrophic failure of leadership, but rather through the kind of gradual psychological erosion that occurs when someone whose identity has been constructed around claims of superior wisdom and moral authority finds himself confronted with evidence that his fundamental assumptions about himself and the world have been proven catastrophically wrong by events that cannot be explained away through his usual arsenal of rhetorical sophistication and philosophical rationalization. The weeks and months that followed the Blackwater disaster would reveal not the sudden transformation of a good man into a villain, but rather the slow unveiling of character flaws and moral weaknesses that had always been present beneath the surface of Dutch's charismatic leadership, waiting for the right combination of pressure and circumstances to emerge into full view of those who had invested their lives and loyalty in his vision of principled rebellion against an unjust world. The psychological mechanisms that Dutch employed to protect himself from acknowledging the full magnitude of his failure at Blackwater were precisely the same defense strategies that had once enabled him to maintain his self-image as a noble outlaw while engaging in activities that any honest, moral analysis would have to classify as simple criminal predation. Yet now these familiar patterns of rationalization and deflection were being deployed under circumstances that made their inadequacy and fundamental dishonesty impossible to ignore for anyone who possessed even minimal commitment to intellectual honesty or genuine concern for the welfare of others. The man who had spent decades teaching others to question authority and think critically about the justifications offered by those in power was now demanding that his own followers accept his explanations without question or criticism, creating exactly the kind of authoritarian dynamic that his revolutionary philosophy had supposedly been designed to oppose and replace. The pressure that Dutch experienced during their desperate flight from Blackwater and subsequent exile in the frozen mountains was not merely the external stress of evading capture by increasingly sophisticated law enforcement, agencias, but also the internal psychological strain of maintaining his leadership role while being confronted daily with evidence that his decision-making had resulted in the deaths of people who had trusted him with their lives, and the Cree's destruction of everything he claimed to value most about the community they had built together. The weight of responsibility for these consequences should have crushed anyone who possessed genuine moral sensitivity. Yet Dutch's response was not humble acknowledgement of error and commitment to learning from his mistakes, but rather an increasingly frantic search for alternative explanations that would allow him to maintain his self-image as a wise and principled leader whose only fault had been trusting others too much or failing to anticipate the depth of corruption and duplicity that characterized the, quote, forces arrayed against them. The defensive patterns that emerged in Dutch's interactions with Arthur, Hosea, and other gang members who dared to suggest that perhaps some aspect of their Blackwater strategy might have been flawed, revealed the extent to which his psychological needs had begun to override his capacity for genuine dialogue and collaborative problem-solving, as questions that should have been welcomed as opportunities for learning and improvement were instead interpreted as personal attacks that threatened his authority and required immediate neutralization through whatever combination of intimidation, manipulation, and rhetorical misdirection might prove most effective in shutting down unwanted discussion. The intellectual curiosity and openness to alternative perspectives that had once characterized Dutch's approach to leadership were gradually being replaced by the kind of rigid defensiveness that marked him as someone whose primary concern was protecting his ego rather than serving the welfare of those who depended upon his guidance. Hosea Matthews, whose decades of partnership with Dutch had given him unparalleled insight into his friend's psychological patterns and emotional needs, recognized with growing alarm that the changes he was witnessing were not temporary responses to extreme stress that would fade once their circumstances improved, but rather fundamental alterations in Dutch's character that suggested a process of moral and intellectual deterioration that might prove irreversible if allowed to continue unchecked. The conversations that Hosea attempted to have with Dutch about the need for honest assessment of their mistakes and realistic planning for their future were met with increasingly hostile responses that revealed how completely Dutch's capacity for self-reflection had been compromised by his desperate need to maintain his grandiose self-image despite mounting evidence of its disconnect from reality. The train robbery decision that Dutch made during their mountain exile represented the perfect illustration of how his judgment had been warped by his psychological inability to acknowledge the extent of their problems and the fundamental changes in tactics and strategy that their new circumstances required, as he chose to interpret their desperate need for supplies and money as an opportunity to demonstrate that the Blackwater disaster had not significantly weakened their capabilities or damaged their reputation among the criminal community. The operation itself was planned and executed according to the same assumptions about risk and reward that had guided their activities during more prosperous times. Yet these assumptions no longer bore any meaningful relationship to the reality of their situation as fugitives being actively hunted by agencies with resources and determination that far exceeded anything they had previously encountered. Arthur's attempts to point out the obvious dangers and strategic flaws in Dutch's train robbery plan were dismissed with the kind of condescending irritation that Dutch had once reserved for genuine fools and obvious enemies, revealing how completely his relationship with even his most trusted associates had been poisoned by his need to suppress any information or perspective that might force him to confront uncomfortable truths about his leadership and decision-making. The collaborative approach to planning and problem-solving that had once been their organization's greatest strength was being systematically dismantled by Dutch's growing paranoia and defensive hostility toward anyone who dared to suggest that his wisdom might be fallible, or his strategies might require modification in light of changing circumstances. The success of the train robbery, measured purely in terms of immediate financial benefit and the absence of casualties among gang members, was seized upon by Dutch as vindication of his leadership and proof that those who had questioned his judgment were motivated by cowardice or disloyalty rather than legitimate concern for their collective welfare. The psychological relief that this temporary success provided allowed Dutch to avoid confronting the deeper issues that the Blackwater disaster had raised about his character and competence, while reinforcing his conviction that criticism and alternative perspectives were forms of betrayal that threatened the unity and effectiveness of their organization, rather than essential elements of sound decision-making. Yet even as Dutch celebrated their tactical victory and used it to justify his continued authority over their operations, more perceptive observers could recognize that the train robbery had actually worsened their strategic position by drawing additional attention from law enforcement agencies and confirming their location for enemies who had been systematically closing the net around them since Blackwater. The short-term thinking that prioritized immediate gratification over long-term consequences was becoming a characteristic feature of Dutch's leadership style, reflecting his psychological need to generate quick victories that would validate his self-image, rather than engaging in the kind of patient strategic planning that their survival actually required. The move to Horseshoe Overlook that Dutch presented as a masterful strategic withdrawal to a position of greater safety and operational flexibility was actually a desperate flight from mounting pressure that their train robbery had only intensified. Yet, Dutch's public statements about their new circumstances were characterized by the kind of optimistic confidence that bore no relationship to the objective realities of their situation or the challenges they would inevitably face in trying to rebuild their operations while being actively pursued by increasingly sophisticated enemies. The gap between Dutch's rhetorical claims about their progress and the actual deterioration of their position was becoming so obvious that maintaining the fiction required increasingly elaborate forms of self-deception and reality distortion. The encounter with the Pinkerton agents that Arthur reported from his fishing trip should have served as a wake-up call that forced Dutch to acknowledge the gravity of their situation and the urgent need for fundamental changes in their approach to survival and operations. Yet Dutch's response was characterized by the same dismissive arrogance that had marked his reaction to other warnings and pieces of unwelcome information. The sophisticated intelligence gathering and tracking capabilities that the Pinkertons brought to their pursuit represented exactly the kind of modern law enforcement methods that Dutch's outdated criminal strategies were ill-equipped to counter. Yet his psychological need to maintain his self-image as someone who was smarter than his enemies prevented him from engaging in the kind of honest, tactical assessment that might have revealed effective countermeasures. The philosophy of doing nothing and waiting for their enemies to make mistakes reflected Dutch's fundamental misunderstanding of the changed nature of their situation. As he continued to operate according to assumptions about law enforcement capabilities and motivations that had been outdated for years and were becoming more irrelevant with each passing day. The passive strategy that might have worked against local sheriffs and territorial marshals was suicidally inadequate against federal agents with unlimited resources and the technological advantages that modern communication and transportation systems provided for coordinated pursuit across multiple jurisdictions. The Valentine Bank robbery that Dutch authorized despite their exposed position and the obvious risks involved demonstrated how completely his decision-making had been compromised by his psychological need to prove that their capabilities remained undiminished by recent setbacks, while also revealing his growing inability to distinguish between tactical considerations and emotional gratification in his approach to leadership and strategic planning. The violence that erupted during the robbery was not the result of unforeseen complications or tactical errors, but rather the predictable consequence of conducting high-risk operations while being actively hunted by enemies who had every reason to expect exactly this kind of reckless behavior from targets whose patterns they had been studying for months. The massacre that left multiple law enforcement officers dead, and the town of Valentine traumatized by the level of brutality they had witnessed, represented exactly the kind of escalation that intelligent criminals would have avoided at all costs. Yet Dutch's reaction was not horror at the unnecessary violence or concern about its strategic implications, but rather satisfaction at having demonstrated their continued ability to project force and achieve their immediate objectives, regardless of the opposition they faced. The disconnect between Dutch's emotional response to the Valentine bloodbath and any reasonable assessment of its consequences revealed how thoroughly his moral compass had been corrupted by his need to maintain his grandiose self-image. Despite mounting evidence of his fundamental unfitness for leadership, Micah's growing influence over Dutch's decision-making process during this period was facilitated not by any particular brilliance or insight on Micah's part, but rather by his intuitive understanding of Dutch's psychological vulnerabilities and his willingness to provide the kind of validation and support that Dutch's damaged ego desperately craved. The flattery and encouragement that Micah offered were carefully calibrated to reinforce Dutch's existing delusions, while steering him toward decisions that served Micah's interests, rather than the collective welfare of their recies. Organization. Creating a dynamic where Dutch's need for psychological comfort made him increasingly dependent upon counsel from exactly the wrong source. The marginalization of Hosea's influence that occurred during this period was not the result of any decline in the old man's wisdom or loyalty, but rather a consequence of Dutch's growing inability to tolerate perspectives that challenged his preferred interpretation of events or suggested the need for fundamental changes in his approach to leadership and pain. Decision-making. The democratic instincts that Dutch had once claimed to value as essential features of their organization's moral superiority were being systematically suppressed in favor of an authoritarian structure that prioritized Dutch's emotional needs over practical considerations or ethical constraints. The series of poor decisions that kept their gang in the public spotlight when basic survival strategy demanded they disappear completely into obscurity was driven not by tactical considerations or strategic thinking, but rather by Dutch's psychological compulsion to prove that he remained a significant figure whose actions could influence events and command attention from both enemies and potential admirers. The grandiose gestures and dramatic operations that characterized this period served no purpose beyond feeding Dutch's ego, while systematically destroying their operational security and making their eventual capture or destruction increasingly inevitable. The Rhodes conflict that Dutch initiated through his attempts to manipulate the Grey and Braithwaite families demonstrated his complete failure to understand how the world had changed since his organization's earlier period of success, as his confidence in his ability to outmaneuver local power brokers was based on assumptions about information flow and communication capabilities that were no longer accurate in an era of telegraphs and coordinated law enforcement. The families that Dutch believed he could play against each other while remaining safely above the conflict were actually far more sophisticated and better informed than his outdated intelligence suggested, leading to consequences that anyone with realistic understanding of their situation should have anticipated and avoided. The death of Sean Maguire during the Rhodes operation represented the first clear demonstration that Dutch's leadership failures were not merely theoretical problems or abstract strategic miscalculations, but rather life and death issues that would cost the lives of young people who had trusted him with their safety and their futures. The loss of someone whose youth and enthusiasm had embodied the idealistic aspects of their mission should have forced Dutch to confront the human cost of his increasingly reckless approach to their operations. Yet his response was characterized by the same defensive deflection that had marked his reaction to previous disasters. The massacre in Rhodes that followed Sean's death was not a measured response designed to achieve specific strategic objectives, but rather an emotional outburst that accomplished nothing beyond satisfying Dutch's need for revenge, while further damaging their already precarious position and reputation within the broader criminal community. The level of violence that Dutch authorized and participated in during the Rhodes conflict revealed how completely his capacity for proportional response and strategic thinking had been eroded by his emotional instability and growing disconnection from reality. The Braithwaite Manor assault that culminated their involvement in the Rhodes conflict was planned and executed with the kind of theatrical excess that prioritized dramatic impact over tactical effectiveness, resulting in unnecessary destruction and casualties that served no purpose beyond allowing Dutch to demonstrate his capacity for spectacular violence. The burning of the manor and the extinction of an entire family represented exactly the kind of disproportionate response that intelligent criminals would have avoided. Yet Dutch's satisfaction with the operation revealed how completely his judgment had been warped by his need for grandiose gestures that would validate his self-image as a significant historical figure. The attention that their Rhodes activities drew from the Pinkertons was not an unfortunate coincidence or unforeseeable consequence, but rather the predictable result of conducting high-profile operations while being actively hunted by agencies whose primary mission was tracking and capturing exactly their type of organization. The speed with which their new camp was discovered and their position compromised demonstrated the futility of Dutch's strategy of maintaining their visibility while hoping to evade the consequences of their actions through superior tactics and operational security. The flight from Clemens Point that followed the Pinkerton discovery represented yet another tactical retreat that Dutch presented as a strategic maneuver, while actually constituting further evidence of his complete inability to learn from, experience, or modify his behavior in response to feedback from the environment. The pattern of escalation, exposure, and desperate flight that had characterized their activities since Blackwater was becoming so predictable that their enemies could anticipate their moves and prepare countermeasures with confidence. Yet Dutch remained psychologically incapable of acknowledging this reality or developing alternative approaches. The Saint Denis operation that Dutch planned as their next major score represented the culmination of all the flawed thinking and emotional instability that had characterized his leadership since Blackwater, as he chose to target the most heavily defended financial institution in the most modern and well-policed city in their region, while their organization was already weakened by casualties and demoralized by repeated failures. The bank heist that should have been recognized as suicidal overreach was instead presented by Dutch as a masterstroke that would solve all their problems while demonstrating their continued relevance and capabilities to a world that he believed was underestimating their threat. The planning process for the Saint Denis bank robbery revealed how completely Dutch's decision-making had been compromised by his psychological needs, as he dismissed all reasonable objections and alternative suggestions while surrounding himself with advisors whose primary qualification was their willingness to support whatever course of action would provide him with the greatest emotional satisfaction. The collaborative intelligence and democratic deliberation that had once characterized their organization's approach to major operations were replaced by an authoritarian process that prioritized Dutch's grandiose vision over practical considerations or concern for the welfare of those who would be required to implement his increasingly dangerous schemes. The Saint Denis bank heist that Dutch van der Linde conceived as the grand operation that would restore their organization's fortunes and validate his continued leadership represented not the culmination of strategic brilliance and careful planning that he claimed it to be, but rather the inevitable consequence of a decision-making process that had become so thoroughly corrupted by psychological denial and emotional desperation that it could no longer distinguish between realistic assessment of, quote, opportunities and grandiose fantasy about capabilities that existed only in Dutch's increasingly disconnected imagination. The modern financial institution that Dutch had selected as their target was not the poorly defended frontier bank that their previous successes had taught them to prefer, but rather a fortress of steel and stone in the heart of a major city where law enforcement response times were measured in minutes rather than hours, and escape routes were limited by urban geography that offered few alternatives to main thoroughfares that could easily be blocked or monitored by authorities who had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation since the moment news of their previous activities had reached the desks of federal agents whose primary mission was the destruction of organizations like theirs. The planning meetings that preceded the Saint Denis operation revealed the extent to which Dutch's leadership style had evolved from the collaborative democracy that had once characterized their organization's approach to major decisions into something resembling the authoritarian dictatorship that his revolutionary philosophy had supposedly been designed to oppose. As he dismissed objections and alternative suggestions with the kind of impatient condescension that had once marked his attitude toward genuine fools and obvious enemies, rather than trusted advisors whose wisdom and loyalty had been proven through decades of shared experience and mutual sacrifice. Hosea Matthews, whose partnership with Dutch had formed the intellectual and moral foundation upon which their entire enterprise had been constructed, found his counsel systematically ignored or actively suppressed whenever it conflicted with Dutch's predetermined conclusions about what their circumstances required and what their capabilities could reasonably be expected to accomplish under the increasingly dangerous conditions that surrounded their every movement. The concerns that Arthur Morgan raised about the tactical challenges and strategic risks involved in conducting a major robbery in the most heavily policed city in their region, while being actively hunted by federal agents with unlimited resources and sophisticated tracking capabilities were brushed aside by Dutch with the kind of dismissive arrogance that demonstrated how completely his capacity for realistic assessment had been overwhelmed by his psychological need to prove that recent setbacks had not significantly diminished his relevance or effectiveness as a leader of men and shaper of events. The practical wisdom that Arthur had accumulated through years of implementing Dutch's plans and dealing with their unforeseen complications was treated as evidence of cowardice or lack of vision rather than valuable intelligence that should have been incorporated into their decision-making process. The morning of the Saint Denis bank robbery found Dutch in a state of nervous excitement that bore no relationship to the calm confidence that had once characterized his demeanor before major operations, as his grandiose rhetoric about the significance and implications of their planned activities revealed the extent to which he had come to depend upon dramatic gestures and spectacular demonstrations of force to maintain his sense of self-worth and historical importance. The operation that should have been approached with sober recognition of its dangers and careful attention to minimizing risks had been transformed in Dutch's mind into a kind of theatrical performance designed to demonstrate his continued relevance to a world that he believed was underestimating his threat and dismissing his vision of what criminal nobility could accomplish when guided by superior intelligence and unwavering commitment to principle. The bank itself proved to be everything that pessimistic assessments had suggested it would be and more, as the security measures and defensive preparations that protected the institution's assets were not the makeshift arrangements that characterized frontier banks, but rather the sophisticated systems that modern financial institutions employed to deter exactly the kind of operation that Dutch had convinced himself they could execute with the same casual effectiveness that had marked their earlier successes against less formidable targets. The guards who confronted them were not the poorly trained and inadequately equipped men who had provided minimal resistance during their previous robberies, but rather experienced professionals whose training and equipment were specifically designed to deal with the kinds of tactics and weapons that the van der Linde gang had employed so effectively against smaller and less prepared adversaries. The alarm system that activated within moments of their entry into the building was not the simple bell or whistle that might have provided local notification to nearby law enforcement, but rather a sophisticated network that immediately alerted every police station and federal office within the city, while simultaneously transmitting detailed information about the nature and location of the threat to agencies that had been preparing for exactly this eventuality since the moment their intelligence networks had identified St. Denis as a likely target for the van der Linde gang's next major operation. The response that materialized around the bank within minutes of the alarm was not the scattered and uncoordinated reaction of surprised local authorities, but rather the carefully orchestrated deployment of overwhelming force by agencies that had been anticipating this confrontation and preparing their countermeasures for weeks or months. The siege that developed around the St. Denis Bank as Dutch and his associates found themselves trapped inside a building that had been transformed from their temporary workplace into their potential tomb was characterized not by the kind of tactical maneuvering and strategic thinking that might have provided opportunities for escape or negotiation, but rather by the desperate improvisation of people who had walked into a situation that exceeded their capabilities and challenged their assumptions about their own competence and the effectiveness of methods that had served them well under very different circumstances. The urban environment that surrounded them offered none of the natural advantages and escape routes that had characterized their previous operations, while the coordinated response of multiple law enforcement agencies made their traditional tactics of mobility and superior firepower irrelevant against enemies who possessed both numerical superiority and better equipment. Hosea Matthews, whose wisdom and experience had guided the van der Linde gang through decades of successful criminal activity while maintaining something resembling moral integrity and community cohesion, died not in the glorious confrontation with overwhelming odds that romantic accounts of outlaw heroism might have described, but rather in a moment of confusion and chaos that demonstrated how completely their carefully developed operational procedures had broken down under pressure that exceeded their ability to adapt or respond effectively. The old man who had served as Dutch's conscience and intellectual anchor fell victim not to superior tactics or unavoidable circumstances, but to the predictable consequences of Dutch's refusal to heed warnings and modify plans that any reasonable analysis should have recognized as fundamentally flawed from their conception. The grief that consumed Dutch as he watched his oldest friend and most trusted advisor die in the dusty street outside the bank was complicated by his growing recognition that Hosea's death represented not merely a personal loss, but also the symbolic end of whatever connection their organization had maintained to the moral principles and intellectual sophistication that had once distinguished them from common criminal gangs, whose activities were motivated by nothing more elevated than greed and the desire for immediate gratification. The man who had taught Dutch to think critically about social justice and political philosophy while maintaining practical wisdom about the realities of criminal life was gone, leaving behind only the hollow shell of revolutionary rhetoric that could no longer be sustained by genuine conviction or supported by evidence of positive accomplishment. The capture of John Marston, during the chaos of their attempted escape from St. Denis, represented another devastating blow to the psychological foundation upon which Dutch's sense of identity and purpose had been constructed. As the young man who had been raised from childhood, according to Dutch's vision of what principled outlawry should represent, was now in the hands of enemies who would undoubtedly attempt to extract information about their operations, while offering inducements for cooperation that would test John's loyalty in ways that Dutch was no longer confident his training and indoctrination had adequately prepared him to withstand. The possibility that John might choose survival over solidarity created anxieties about betrayal and internal treachery that Dutch's paranoid psychology was ill-equipped to manage in rational or constructive ways. The death of Lenny Summers during the rooftop fighting that accompanied their desperate attempt to escape from the trap they had walked into represented the sacrifice of youth and idealism to Dutch's increasingly grandiose delusions about their capabilities and historical significance. As the intelligent young man who had believed in their mission and trusted in Dutch's wisdom became another casualty of leadership failures that could no longer be rationalized as temporary setbacks or unforeseeable complications. The waste of potential and the betrayal of trust that Lenny's death represented should have forced Dutch to confront the human cost of his psychological inability to acknowledge error and modify behavior, yet his response was characterized by the same defensive deflection that had marked his reaction to previous disasters. The shipwreck that carried the surviving members of the gang to the island of Guarma was not merely a geographical displacement that would provide them with temporary refuge from their pursuers, but rather a symbolic journey into the kind of moral wilderness that Dutch's leadership had been gradually creating. Through years of compromise and rationalization that had steadily eroded the ethical foundations upon which their community had originally been built, the tropical landscape that surrounded them was both paradise and prison, offering natural beauty that contrasted sharply with the psychological and spiritual desolation that had come to characterize their relationships and their understanding of their place in the world. The isolation and desperation of their circumstances on Guarma created conditions that stripped away the last vestiges of civilized behavior and moral constraint that had previously limited Dutch's capacity for cruelty, self-serving action, revealing aspects of his character that had remained hidden beneath layers of philosophical sophistication and carefully cultivated charm during the years. When maintaining his public image as a principled leader had served his interests and supported his psychological needs, the man who had once preached about protecting the innocent and fighting against oppression was now displaying the same casual disregard for human life and dignity that characterized the systems he claimed to oppose. The murder of the elderly Cuban woman who had attempted to assist them represented the clearest possible demonstration of how completely Dutch's moral compass had been corrupted by his psychological need to maintain control and avoid acknowledging the extent of their problems, as he killed someone whose only crime had been existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, while he was struggling with anxieties and pressures that his damaged ego could no longer process in rational or constructive ways. The justification he offered for this killing revealed the depth of his self-deception and his growing inability to distinguish between legitimate threats and innocent bystanders who happened to inconvenience him. Arthur Morgan's horror at witnessing Dutch's transformation into someone capable of such casual brutality represented the beginning of his own psychological break from the man who had served as father figure and moral authority throughout his adult life, as he was forced to confront the possibility that the principles and values he had been taught to revere were nothing more than elaborate justifications for behavior that was fundamentally no different from that of the common criminals and corrupt officials they had spent years claiming to oppose. The realization that Dutch might have always been capable of such actions, but had simply lacked the pressure and opportunity to reveal this aspect of his nature, created a crisis of faith that would fundamentally alter Arthur's understanding of himself and his place in the world. The exploitation of the Cuban revolutionaries that Dutch orchestrated during their time on Guam demonstrated his complete abandonment of any pretense that his actions were motivated by genuine concern for social justice or political freedom, as he manipulated desperate people who were fighting for their homeland's independence into serving his immediate needs for escape and revenge, without any consideration for the consequences his interference might have for their cause or their lives. The parallels between Dutch's behavior and that of the colonial oppressors he had always claimed to oppose were so obvious that maintaining his self-image required increasingly elaborate forms of psychological denial and reality distortion. The return journey to America provided Dutch with extended opportunities for reflection that might have led to genuine acknowledgement of his errors and commitment to fundamental changes in his approach to leadership and decision-making. Yet the isolation and pressure of their circumstances seemed to accelerate rather than moderate his psychological deterioration, as he became increasingly paranoid about the loyalty of his remaining followers, while simultaneously developing grandiose theories about conspiracies and betrayals that existed primarily in his damaged imagination. The man who landed on the American coast bore only superficial resemblance to the charismatic leader who had departed months earlier, as fundamental aspects of his personality had been warped beyond recognition by experiences that had revealed the true nature of his character. The reunion with the surviving members of their organization, who had managed to evade capture during the chaos that followed the Saint Denis disaster, revealed how thoroughly their community had been damaged by the accumulated stresses and losses of the previous months, as relationships of trust and mutual support that had taken years to develop had been poisoned by suspicion and recrimination, while the shared sense of purpose that had once held them together had been replaced by simple concern for individual survival. The family atmosphere that Dutch had always claimed was their greatest strength and most important achievement had been destroyed by his own actions and decisions, leaving behind only the shell of an organization held together by habit and fear rather than genuine loyalty or common commitment to meaningful principles. Micah Bell's growing influence over Dutch's decision-making process during this period was facilitated not by any superior insight or wisdom on his part, but rather by his intuitive understanding of Dutch's psychological vulnerabilities and his willingness to provide the kind of validation and support that Dutch's damaged ego desperately craved while steering him toward decisions that served Micah's interests rather than the collective welfare of their rapidly disintegrating organization. The counsel that Micah offered was carefully calculated to reinforce Dutch's paranoid suspicions and grandiose delusions, while isolating him from sources of alternative perspective that might have provided more realistic assessments of their situation and their options. The accusations of betrayal and disloyalty that Dutch began to level against John and Arthur represented perhaps the cruelest irony in the entire saga of his moral decline, as the two young men who had sacrificed more than anyone else for the sake of his vision and their shared family were now being scapegoated for failures that were entirely the result of Dutch's own poor judgment and psychological inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his actions. The paranoid logic that allowed Dutch to interpret their legitimate concerns and reasonable suggestions as evidence of treachery revealed how completely his capacity for honest evaluation of human motivations had been destroyed by his need to protect his self-image from uncomfortable truths. The systematic marginalization of Arthur's influence within their organization was not based on any decline in his capabilities or commitment, but rather on Dutch's growing recognition that Arthur's moral clarity and practical wisdom represented a constant threat to the elaborate structure of self-deception and rationalization upon which his continued authority depended. The man who had been Dutch's most trusted lieutenant and most devoted follower was gradually being transformed into an enemy whose very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of what Dutch had once claimed to represent and what he had actually become through years of compromise and moral decay. The gang's gradual disintegration as members fled or died was not the result of external pressure or unforeseeable circumstances, but rather the predictable consequence of Dutch's transformation from inspiring leader into paranoid tyrant whose primary concern was maintaining his authority rather than serving the welfare of those who had entrusted him with their lives and their futures. The community that had once provided refuge and purpose for society's outcasts was being destroyed from within by the very person who had created it. As Dutch's psychological needs had become incompatible with the responsibilities of genuine leadership, the final operations that Dutch authorized during this period served no strategic purpose or practical benefit for their organization, but rather functioned as desperate attempts to prove that he remained a significant figure whose actions could influence events and command attention from both enemies and potential admirers, regardless of the cost in human life or the damage to their already precarious position. The grandiose gestures and theatrical violence that characterized these activities revealed how completely Dutch's judgment had been corrupted by his need for validation and recognition, while the predictable failures that resulted from his increasingly reckless approach to planning and execution provided additional evidence of his unfitness for leadership. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Dutch to maintain his faith in his own wisdom and righteousness, despite overwhelming evidence of his failures and moral corruption, were the same defense strategies that had enabled him to rationalize years of criminal activity as expressions of social justice. Yet now these familiar patterns of self-deception were being employed under circumstances that made their inadequacy and fundamental dishonesty impossible to ignore for anyone who retained even minimal commitment to intellectual honesty or genuine concern for others. The man who had once taught others to question authority and think critically about the justifications offered by those in power was now demanding absolute loyalty and unquestioning obedience from followers whose lives and welfare he was systematically sacrificing to his psychological needs and grandiose delusions about his historical significance. The final corruption that would transform Dutch van der Linde from a flawed but recognizably human leader into something approaching a monster began not with any single moment of dramatic moral collapse, but rather through the systematic abandonment of every principle and constraint that had once provided structure for his decision-making and boundaries for his behavior. As the psychological defenses that had allowed him to maintain his self-image while engaging in increasingly questionable activities evolved into a form of complete moral blindness that made him incapable of recognizing the difference between justice and revenge, protection and exploitation, leadership and tyranny. The man who returned from Guama bore only superficial resemblance to the charismatic outlaw philosopher who had departed months earlier, as fundamental aspects of his personality had been corrupted beyond recognition by experiences that had revealed the true nature of his character, while stripping away the last vestiges of ethical constraint that had previously limited his capacity for cruelty and self-serving action. The alliance that Dutch formed with Eagle Flies and the Wapiti tribe represented perhaps the most cynical and morally bankrupt decision in his entire career of rationalized criminality, as he deliberately manipulated the desperate circumstances of people who were facing systematic oppression and cultural extinction to serve his own immediate tactical needs, while disguising his exploitation as principled support for their struggle against the very forces of governmental authority that he claimed to oppose. The young Native American leader who sought Dutch's assistance was motivated by genuine love for his people and sincere desire to protect their homeland from the encroachment of industrial development and military occupation. Yet Dutch's response to this plea for help was not the solidarity and mutual support that his revolutionary rhetoric had always promised, but rather calculated exploitation that would ultimately result in unnecessary deaths and the acceleration of the very destruction that Eagle Flies was trying to prevent. The conversations that Dutch conducted with the Wapiti leadership demonstrated his complete mastery of the rhetorical techniques that had always been his greatest weapon and most dangerous tool, as he employed sophisticated arguments about shared oppression and common enemies to convince desperate people that his interests and theirs were fundamentally aligned, while carefully concealing his actual intentions and the inevitable consequences that his involvement would bring to their already precarious situation. The philosophical framework that Dutch had developed over decades of criminal activity provided him with an elaborate vocabulary for describing exploitation as liberation and manipulation as partnership, creating the intellectual cover necessary for actions that any honest moral analysis would have to condemn as unconscionable betrayal of trust and cynical abuse of power. The oil fields that became the focus of Dutch's collaboration with the Wapiti tribe represented everything that his political philosophy had supposedly been constructed to oppose, as the industrial development and environmental destruction that characterized these operations embodied the exact combination of corporate greed and governmental complicity that he had spent years identifying as the primary enemies of individual freedom and community autonomy. Yet Dutch's response to the opportunity for striking against these symbolic targets was not motivated by genuine commitment to the principles he espoused, but rather by his recognition that Native American grievances and military capabilities could be weaponized to serve his personal need for dramatic gestures and spectacular demonstrations of his continued relevance as a force capable of influencing historical events. The tactical planning that Dutch conducted for their operations against the oil fields revealed how completely his strategic thinking had been corrupted by his psychological need for theatrical excess and grandiose symbolism, as he prioritized dramatic impact and media attention over practical considerations about casualties, long-term consequences, or the welfare of the people whose desperation he was exploiting for his own purposes. The attacks that should have been designed to minimize harm while achieving specific political objectives were instead conceived as apocalyptic spectacles that would demonstrate Dutch's capacity for destruction while providing him with the kind of historical significance that his damaged ego required for psychological survival. The violence that erupted during these operations was not the measured application of force necessary for achieving legitimate military objectives, but rather the kind of indiscriminate brutality that characterized terrorism rather than revolutionary resistance, as Dutch's inability to distinguish between combatants and civilians led to casualties that served no purpose beyond satisfying his need for revenge against a world that had failed to acknowledge his wisdom and moral authority. The oil workers who died during these attacks were not the corporate executives or government officials whose policies had created the conditions that justified resistance, but rather ordinary people trying to earn honest livings in circumstances that offered few alternatives to the dangerous and exploitative employment that industrial development provided. Arthur Morgan's growing horror at witnessing Dutch's transformation into someone capable of such casual disregard for innocent life was complicated by his recognition that this was not some temporary aberration brought on by extreme circumstances, but rather the logical culmination of tendencies that had been developing for years beneath the surface of philosophical sophistication and carefully cultivated charm. The man who was now ordering the deaths of people whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time was the same person who had rescued Arthur from childhood destitution and taught him to value loyalty and brotherhood above material considerations, creating a cognitive dissonance that challenged everything Arthur thought he knew about human nature and moral development. The abandonment that Arthur experienced during the oil field assault represented the ultimate betrayal of every principle that Dutch had claimed to value about family loyalty and mutual responsibility, as Dutch's decision to flee rather than assist his wounded lieutenant revealed how completely his capacity for genuine human connection had been destroyed by his psychological need to prioritize his own survival over the welfare of those who had sacrificed everything for his vision. The man who had once preached about the importance of never leaving anyone behind was now willing to abandon his most devoted follower to certain death or capture rather than risk his own safety in a rescue attempt that might have interfered with his escape plans. The conversation that Arthur and Charles shared in the aftermath of this betrayal provided perhaps the most insightful analysis of Dutch's psychological deterioration that anyone within their organization had yet articulated, as Charles's observation that Dutch had either become someone fundamentally different from who he had once been, or had simply revealed aspects of his character that had always been present but carefully concealed, created a framework for understanding the tragedy that was unfolding around them. The question of whether Dutch's current behavior represented transformation or revelation would continue to haunt those who survived their association with him, as both interpretations carried implications about human nature and moral development that were too disturbing to contemplate comfortably. The murder of Leviticus Cornwall that Dutch committed in broad daylight with multiple witnesses represented the apotheosis of his transformation from calculating criminal into impulsive killer whose actions were motivated not by strategic considerations or moral principles, but rather by pure emotional gratification and the psychological need to demonstrate his power over those who had dared to oppose or inconvenience him. The industrial magnate whose business practices and political influence had made him a legitimate target for revolutionary resistance was killed not through careful planning designed to achieve maximum symbolic impact while minimizing collateral damage, but rather through the kind of spontaneous violence that characterized personal revenge rather than political action. The speech that Dutch delivered before killing Cornwall revealed the extent to which his intellectual sophistication had been corrupted into mere rhetorical flourish, designed to provide post hoc justification for decisions that were actually motivated by wounded pride and psychological instability rather than genuine commitment to the principles he continued to espouse. The philosophical arguments about systematic oppression and revolutionary necessity that Dutch employed to rationalize his actions bore no meaningful relationship to the actual circumstances that had prompted his decision to commit murder, while his obvious satisfaction with the theatrical aspects of the killing demonstrated how completely his moral reasoning had been subordinated to his need for dramatic self-expression. The immediate consequences of Cornwall's assassination were entirely predictable to anyone with realistic understanding of how law enforcement agencies would respond to the public execution of a prominent businessman by a known criminal organization. Yet Dutch's reaction to the increased scrutiny and coordinated pursuit that followed revealed his complete disconnection from the practical realities of their situation and his growing belief that he could somehow transcend normal, cause and effect relationships through superior intelligence and revolutionary commitment. The manhunt that intensified following Cornwall's death was not evidence of systematic oppression or corrupt governmental overreach, but rather the natural response of a functional legal system to brazen criminality that threatened the basic security upon which civilized society depended. The exploitation of the Wapiti tribe's military capabilities that Dutch orchestrated during this period was conducted with such obvious disregard for their welfare and long-term interests that even the most charitable interpretation of his motivations could not disguise the fundamental selfishness and cynical manipulation that characterized his approach to what should have been a partnership based on mutual respect and shared objectives. The young warriors who died fighting battles that served Dutch's psychological needs rather than their own people's survival were sacrificed to his grandiose delusions about historical significance and revolutionary necessity, while their deaths accomplished nothing beyond providing temporary tactical advantages that were immediately squandered through Dutch's inability to develop coherent long-term strategies. Eagle Flies' tragic fate represented the inevitable consequence of trusting someone whose commitment to revolutionary principles was actually subordinated to personal psychological needs that made him incapable of genuine solidarity or mutual support, as the young leader's death served no purpose beyond satisfying Dutch's need for dramatic martyrdom, while destroying one of the few authentic voices for Native American resistance that possessed both the moral authority and practical capabilities necessary for effective political action. The waste of potential and betrayal of trust that Eagle Flies' death represented should have forced Dutch to confront the human cost of his psychological inability to distinguish between genuine leadership and theatrical self-aggrandizement. Yet his response was characterized by the same defensive rationalization that had marked his reaction to previous disasters. The systematic destruction of relationships within the Van der Linde gang that accelerated during this period was not the result of external pressure or unforeseeable circumstances, but rather the predictable consequence of Dutch's transformation into someone whose primary concern was maintaining his authority and protecting his self-image, rather than serving the welfare of those who had entrusted him with their lives and futures. The loyalty that had once bound their community together was being systematically destroyed by Dutch's paranoid suspicions and increasing demands for absolute obedience, while the democratic processes that had once characterized their decision-making were replaced by authoritarian structures that brooked no dissent or alternative perspectives. The accusations of betrayal and treachery that Dutch began to level against long-standing members of their organization were not based on evidence or rational analysis, but rather on his psychological need to identify scapegoats who could be blamed for failures that were entirely the result of his own poor judgment and moral corruption. The paranoid logic that allowed him to interpret legitimate concerns and reasonable suggestions as evidence of disloyalty revealed how completely his capacity for honest evaluation of human motivations had been destroyed by his desperate need to maintain his grandiose self-image despite mounting evidence of its complete disconnect from reality. Arthur Morgan's terminal diagnosis provided him with the psychological freedom necessary for honest assessment of Dutch's character and leadership that his previous emotional dependence and loyalty had made impossible, as the certainty of his approaching death liberated him from the long-term considerations and political calculations that had previously constrained his ability to act according to his deepest moral convictions. The man who had spent decades suppressing his own ethical instincts in service of loyalty to someone whose wisdom he had never dared to question was finally free to trust his own judgment about right and wrong, regardless of how such independence might threaten his position within the organization or his relationship with the man who had shaped his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The conversations that Arthur began to have with other gang members about the possibility of leaving their criminal existence represented a fundamental challenge to the psychological foundation upon which Dutch's authority was based, as these discussions implied that there might be alternatives to the life of perpetual conflict and moral compromise that Dutch had convinced them was their only option for maintaining their dignity and independence in a world dominated by corrupt institutions and oppressive authority. The very suggestion that individual members might find happiness and fulfillment outside the context of their shared struggle was interpreted by Dutch as a form of betrayal that threatened the ideological coherence upon which his leadership depended. The practical assistance that Arthur began to provide for gang members who wanted to escape their criminal lifestyle was motivated not by any desire to undermine Dutch's authority or destroy their organization, but rather by his growing recognition that true loyalty sometimes required helping people avoid the destruction that their current path was leading toward inevitably. The advice and financial support that Arthur offered to those who were ready to embrace legitimate lives represented the kind of genuine care for individual welfare that Dutch's abstract philosophizing about collective struggle had systematically neglected in favor of grand theories about historical necessity and revolutionary commitment. The women of the gang, whose voices had always been marginalized within their masculine hierarchy despite their obvious intelligence and valuable contributions to their collective survival, began to receive from Arthur the kind of practical encouragement and emotional support for their individual aspirations that Dutch's vision of criminal nobility had never adequately addressed or incorporated into its theoretical end framework. The opportunities for education, career development, and family formation that Arthur helped them to pursue represented exactly the kind of personal fulfillment and social integration that Dutch's ideology had trained them to reject as bourgeois compromise and betrayal of their revolutionary principles. Mary Beth Gaskell's literary aspirations, Tilly Jackson's romantic relationships, and Karen Jones's struggles with depression and alcohol addiction were addressed by Arthur with a combination of practical assistance and emotional validation that demonstrated his growing understanding that individual happiness and personal development were more important than abstract loyalty to causes that served primarily to justify the preferences and psychological needs of their supposed leaders. The genuine care that Arthur displayed for their welfare as human beings, rather than simply as contributors to their criminal enterprise, represented a form of moral maturity that Dutch's authoritarian leadership style had systematically discouraged. The education and guidance that Arthur provided for Jack Marston during this period was motivated by his recognition that the child represented both the greatest hope for breaking the cycle of violence and criminality that had trapped multiple generations of their makeshift family, and the most vulnerable victim of Dutch's inability to acknowledge the human cost of his grandiose delusions about historical significance and revolutionary necessity. The fishing trips and conversations that Arthur shared with the boy were designed not only to provide him with positive memories of adult guidance, but also to plant seeds of ethical understanding that might grow into genuine alternatives to the patterns of moral compromise and rationalized violence that had characterized the adult relationships he had witnessed throughout his base childhood. The systematic marginalization of Arthur's influence that Dutch orchestrated during this period was not based on any decline in Arthur's capabilities or loyalty, but rather on Dutch's growing recognition that Arthur's moral clarity and commitment to individual welfare represented a constant threat to the elaborate structure of self-deception and rationalization upon which his continued authority depended. The man who had been Dutch's most trusted lieutenant and most devoted follower was being transformed into an ideological enemy whose very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of what Dutch had once claimed to represent and what he had actually become through years of psychological deterioration and moral corruption. The final operations that Dutch authorized during this period of complete moral bankruptcy were characterized not by strategic planning or realistic assessment of their capabilities and circumstances, but rather by the kind of desperate improvisation and theatrical excess that revealed how completely his decision-making had been subordinated to his psychological need for validation and recognition, regardless of the cost in human life or the damage to their already hopeless position. The robberies and acts of terrorism that provided no practical benefit to their organization while dramatically increasing the dangers they faced served only to satisfy Dutch's compulsive need to prove that he remained a significant figure whose actions could influence events and command attention from both enemies and potential admirers. The isolation that Dutch experienced during these final months of his reign as leader of the Van der Linde gang was not the result of external pressure or systematic persecution, but rather the inevitable consequence of his transformation into someone whose primary relationship was with his own grandiose self-image, rather than with the real human beings whose lives and welfare had been entrusted to his care. The man who had once been capable of inspiring genuine loyalty and affection through his charisma and philosophical sophistication had become someone whose presence was tolerated only by those who lacked the courage or opportunity to escape, while his closest associates were either sycophants who fed his delusions or enemies whose opposition he was psychologically incapable of distinguishing from the legitimate concerns of people who still cared enough about him to attempt intervention. The reckoning that would finally force Dutch van der Linde to confront the full magnitude of his moral collapse and psychological deterioration did not arrive through the dramatic confrontation with overwhelming external forces that his grandiose self-image might have preferred, but rather through the slow accumulation of consequences that had been building for years beneath his elaborate structure of rationalization and self-deception, until the weight of his failures and betrayals became too heavy for even his sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms to support or disguise. The 8 years that separated the final disintegration of the Van der Linde gang from Dutch's eventual confrontation with Micah Bell on the frozen slopes of Mount Hagen were not a period of reflection and moral growth that might have led to genuine redemption, but rather a continuation of the same patterns of violence and self-serving justification that had characterized his leadership during its final destructive phase, as he proved incapable of learning from experience or acknowledging the role that his own choices had played in destroying everything he claimed to value most deeply. The criminal career that Dutch pursued during these years of exile and isolation was characterized not by the philosophical sophistication and principled rebellion that had once distinguished his activities from simple predation, but rather by the kind of mindless brutality and cynical opportunism that he had always claimed to oppose in his criticisms of common criminal gangs, whose activities were motivated by nothing more elevated than greed and the desire for immediate gratification, The operations that he conducted with whatever followers he could attract were marked by unnecessary violence and complete disregard for the welfare of innocent bystanders, revealing how thoroughly his capacity for moral reasoning had been destroyed by years of prioritizing his psychological needs over ethical considerations or practical wisdom about the long-term consequences of his actions. The gang that Dutch assembled during this period consisted primarily of individuals whose primary qualifications were their willingness to follow orders without question and their lack of moral sensitivity that might have made them uncomfortable with the increasingly brutal methods that Dutch employed to maintain his authority and achieve his objectives, creating an organization that bore no resemblance to the alternative family structure that had once provided refuge and purpose for society's outcasts, while maintaining some connection to principles that elevated their activities above mere criminality. The loyalty that bound these new followers to Dutch was based not on shared ideological commitment or genuine affection, but rather on fear and the kind of mutual dependence that characterizes relationships between predators who recognize that their individual survival depends upon their continued cooperation in activities that isolate them from any possibility of legitimate social integration. The reputation that Dutch built during these years was not the romantic legend of the gentleman outlaw that he had once cultivated so carefully, but rather the kind of fearsome notoriety that attached to individuals whose unpredictability and capacity for extreme violence made them dangerous to approach or attempt to negotiate with under any circumstances. The stories that spread about his activities were not tales of principled rebellion against systematic oppression, but rather accounts of senseless brutality and psychological instability that served as warnings to potential victims and competitors about the risks involved in any form of contact or confrontation with someone whose behavior could no longer be predicted or constrained by normal considerations of self-interest or rational calculation. The psychological deterioration that Dutch experienced during this period was not the gradual decline that might have been expected from someone struggling with the accumulated stress and trauma of their criminal lifestyle, but rather an acceleration of the paranoid and grandiose tendencies that had been developing for years, as his isolation from genuine human connection and his continued need to maintain his self-image as a significant historical figure created a form of reality distortion that made it increasingly difficult for him to distinguish between his internal fantasies and the external world that continued to resist his attempts to impose his will through violence and intimidation. The man who had once been capable of sophisticated political analysis and strategic thinking had devolved into someone whose decision-making was dominated by emotional impulses and psychological needs that bore no relationship to practical considerations about consequences or effectiveness. The hunting of Micah Bell that eventually brought Dutch back into contact with the surviving members of his original organization was not motivated by genuine remorse for the role that Micah's influence had played in destroying their community, but rather by his need to identify a scapegoat who could be held responsible for failures that Dutch remained psychologically incapable of acknowledging as the predictable consequences of his own character defects and moral corruption. The years that he had spent tracking Micah across the American frontier had provided ample opportunity for honest self-reflection and genuine acknowledgement of his errors. Yet Dutch's response to this extended period of solitude and introspection had been to develop increasingly elaborate theories about betrayal and conspiracy that allowed him to maintain his grandiose self-image while avoiding any uncomfortable examination of his own role in the disasters that had befallen everyone who had trusted him. The confrontation on Mount Hagen that would finally bring Dutch face to face with the consequences of his psychological inability to accept responsibility for his actions was set in motion not by any grand design or carefully orchestrated plan for justice, but rather by the convergence of multiple independent efforts to locate and destroy Micah Bell, whose continued existence represented a threat not only to those who sought revenge for past betrayals, but also to anyone who might be unfortunate enough to encounter someone whose capacity for violence and treachery had been refined through years of association with increasingly desperate and morally bankrupt criminal organizations. The mountain clearing where these various forces would ultimately meet was not chosen for its symbolic significance or strategic advantages, but rather represented the predictable endpoint of a pursuit that had been driven more by emotional compulsion than tactical planning. John Marston's participation in the hunt for Micah was motivated not by any desire to rescue Dutch from the consequences of his poor judgment, but rather by his recognition that Micah's continued existence posed an ongoing threat to the peaceful life that he was attempting to build with his family at Beecher's Hope, while also representing unfinished business from a period of his life that he was struggling to integrate into his understanding of himself as someone capable of legitimate happiness and moral respectability. The years that John had spent learning to be a husband and father had not erased his memories of the betrayals and violence that had characterized the final period of the Van der Linde gang, yet they had provided him with sufficient perspective to recognize that pursuing vengeance might jeopardize everything he had worked to build through honest labor and genuine commitment to the welfare of others. Sadie Adler's involvement in the expedition represented the culmination of her own journey from victim to agent of justice, as her transformation from grieving widow to skilled bounty hunter had provided her with both the capabilities and the legal authority necessary for tracking down and eliminating individuals whose crimes had placed them beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement agencies. The professional skills and emotional detachment that Sadie had developed during her years of hunting fugitives were perfectly suited to the challenges involved in locating and confronting someone whose survival instincts and capacity for violence made him one of the most dangerous individuals operating on the American frontier during that period of social transition and institutional weakness. Charles Smith's participation in their mission was motivated not by personal animosity toward Micah or loyalty to Dutch's memory, but rather by his recognition that some forms of evil could not be allowed to continue unchecked without diminishing the moral fabric of the communities that were struggling to establish civilized order in territories that had recently been dominated by lawlessness and violence. The practical wisdom and ethical clarity that Charles had maintained throughout his association with the Van der Linde gang had enabled him to recognize both the legitimate grievances that motivated their pursuit of Micah and the dangers involved in allowing personal desires for revenge to override considerations of justice and proportional response. The discovery of Dutch's presence at Micah's mountain hideout represented the final opportunity for redemption that circumstances would provide for someone whose psychological trajectory had been characterized by steadily increasing moral blindness and grandiose self-deception. Yet Dutch's response to this confrontation revealed how completely his capacity for genuine acknowledgement of error and commitment to positive change had been destroyed by years of prioritizing his psychological needs over honest self-assessment and concern for the welfare of others. The man who appeared on the mountain that day was not seeking forgiveness or attempting to make amends for his past failures, but rather pursuing his own agenda for settling scores and eliminating the last remaining witness to his moral corruption. The conversation that Dutch attempted to have with John during their mountain confrontation was characterized by the same mixture of philosophical sophistication and psychological manipulation that had once made him such an effective leader and teacher. Yet the context within which these familiar rhetorical techniques were now being employed revealed how thoroughly they had been corrupted into mere instruments for avoiding accountability and maintaining his grandiose self-image. Despite overwhelming evidence of his moral bankruptcy, the invitation that Dutch extended for John to rejoin their criminal partnership was not based on genuine affection or realistic assessment of their shared interests, but rather on his desperate need to validate his continued relevance and historical significance through the loyalty of someone whose respect and devotion he had systematically forfeited through years of betrayal and moral compromise. John's response to Dutch's overtures demonstrated the extent to which his own moral development and life experience had provided him with the psychological tools necessary for recognizing and resisting the manipulative techniques that had once made him such a devoted follower, as his years of building a legitimate life with Abigail and Jack had taught him to value stability and genuine human connection over the dramatic excitement and philosophical justifications that had once made criminal activity seem like a romantic rebellion against an unjust world. The man who had once been willing to die for Dutch's vision of outlaw nobility was now capable of seeing through the elaborate rationalizations and rhetorical flourishes to recognize the fundamental selfishness and moral cowardice that had always motivated Dutch's behavior. The shooting of Micah Bell that Dutch finally accomplished after years of pursuit was not the act of justice or moral redemption that he might have preferred to claim, but rather the elimination of a witness whose continued existence served as an uncomfortable reminder of Dutch's own complicity in the betrayals and violence that had destroyed their original community, while revealing the true nature of his character to anyone who bothered to look beyond his bare, carefully constructed public image. The execution was carried out not through careful planning designed to minimize collateral damage and ensure that justice was served according to proper procedures, but rather through the kind of impulsive violence that had come to characterize Dutch's approach to problem-solving when psychological pressure exceeded his capacity for rational calculation. The symbolic significance that Dutch's killing of Micah might have possessed as an acknowledgement of his errors and a first step toward genuine redemption was immediately negated by his decision to walk away from the confrontation without offering any explanation or accepting responsibility for his role in creating the circumstances that had made such violence necessary, revealing that his primary motivation had been not moral conviction, but rather the psychological need to eliminate someone whose existence challenged his preferred narrative about the causes of their collective downfall. The man who departed into the wilderness after Micah's death was not someone who had achieved meaningful insight into his own character or developed genuine commitment to positive change, but rather someone who had simply removed an obstacle to his continued self-deception. The philosophical autopsy that any honest examination of Dutch's character and career would have to conduct must grapple with the fundamental questions about human nature and moral development that his story raises, particularly the extent to which his ultimate moral bankruptcy represented the revelation of character traits that had always been present but carefully concealed, versus the genuine transformation of someone who had once possessed authentic virtue and wisdom, but had been corrupted by circumstances and psychological pressures that exceeded his capacity for moral resistance. The evidence that supports both interpretations is sufficiently compelling to make definitive judgment difficult, yet the practical consequences of Dutch's leadership failures remain constant regardless of which theoretical framework one employs for understanding their psychological and moral origins. The tragedy of Dutch van der Linde lies not in the simple fact that he became corrupt and caused suffering for others, but rather in his extraordinary potential for positive leadership and genuine moral influence that was systematically wasted through his inability to maintain the intellectual honesty and emotional humility that effective service to others requires from those who accept positions of authority and responsibility. The charisma and philosophical sophistication that made him capable of inspiring such devoted loyalty could have been employed in service of causes that actually served the welfare of society's outcasts and victims. Yet his psychological needs for validation and historical significance made it impossible for him to subordinate his ego to the genuine requirements of moral leadership. The question of whether Dutch genuinely believed his own philosophy or was simply using it as elaborate justification for self-serving behavior cannot be answered definitively based on external observation of his actions and statements. Yet the practical consequences of his leadership style remain destructive. Regardless of his internal motivations or level of conscious awareness about the gap between his noble rhetoric and his actual priorities. The individuals who died believing in his vision of principled rebellion were not saved from tragedy by whatever sincere conviction Dutch might have possessed about the righteousness of their cause, while those who survived their association with him were left to grapple with questions about trust and moral judgment that would influence their relationships and decisions for the remainder of their lives. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Dutch to maintain his grandiose self-image despite overwhelming evidence of his moral failures and practical incompetence represent a form of willful blindness that is both more common and more dangerous than the simple evil that characterizes individuals who consciously choose to harm others for personal benefit. As Dutch's elaborate rationalizations and philosophical sophistication made it possible for him to cause tremendous suffering while genuinely believing that he was serving noble purposes and fighting against systematic injustice. The self-deception that protected his ego from uncomfortable truths also made it impossible for him to learn from experience or modify his behavior in response to feedback from the environment. The ultimate meaning of Dutch van der Linde's life and career must be sought not in his grandiose proclamations about freedom and justice, but rather in the concrete consequences of his leadership for the real human beings who trusted him with their lives and futures. As the gap between his noble intentions and his actual accomplishments serves as a powerful reminder that good intentions are not sufficient to justify harmful actions or to absolve leaders from responsibility for the foreseeable consequences of their decisions. The trail of broken lives and wasted potential that Dutch left behind represents the true measure of his historical significance. Regardless of whatever philosophical insights or moments of authentic virtue might have characterized his better periods, the silence that Dutch maintained about his own culpability in the disasters that had befallen his followers was not evidence of wisdom or dignity, but rather the final expression of the moral cowardice that had characterized his entire approach to leadership and responsibility, as his inability to acknowledge his errors, even at the moment when such acknowledgement might have provided some measure of redemption for those who had suffered because of his failures, revealed how completely his capacity for genuine moral courage had been destroyed by years of prioritizing his psychological comfort over the welfare of others. The man who walked away from Mount Hagen carried with him not the burden of hard-earned wisdom, but rather the same elaborate structure of self-deception that had made his destructive leadership possible in the first place. The legacy that Dutch van der Linde left behind in the lives of those who followed him to the bitter end was not the noble inheritance of revolutionary principles and moral courage that his philosophical rhetoric had always promised, but rather the tragic demonstration of how completely sincere idealism could be corrupted when placed in service of a leader whose psychological needs had gradually overwhelmed his capacity for genuine concern about the welfare of others. creating a cautionary tale about the dangers of unquestioning loyalty to charismatic individuals whose grandiose self-image made them incapable of acknowledging error or accepting the kind of constructive criticism that effective leadership requires from those who would serve causes larger than their own immediate gratification. The young men who died believing in Dutch's vision of principled rebellion against systematic oppression were not saved from the consequences of their misplaced faith by whatever authentic conviction might have motivated their leaders' early activities, while their death served no purpose beyond validating Dutch's continued relevance in his own mind and providing him with the kind of dramatic martyrdom that his damaged psychology required for maintaining its elaborate structure. Self-deception. Bill Williamson, whose limited intellectual capacity and desperate need for structure and belonging had made him one of Dutch's most devoted followers during the years when their organization maintained some connection to the moral principles it claimed to represent, continued the pattern of violence and criminality that he had learned under Dutch's tutelage without possessing any of the philosophical sophistication or charismatic leadership ability that had once distinguished their activities from simple predation and terrorism. The gang that Bill assembled after Dutch's final disappearance was characterized by exactly the kind of mindless brutality and opportunistic cruelty that Dutch had always claimed to oppose in his criticisms of common criminal organizations. Yet Bill's approach to leadership was merely a crude imitation of Dutch's methods, without any of the intellectual framework or rhetorical skill that had made those methods effective during their period of greatest success. The operations that Bill conducted with his followers were marked by unnecessary violence and complete disregard for the welfare of innocent bystanders, revealing how thoroughly Dutch's example had corrupted the moral reasoning of someone who might otherwise have been capable of finding legitimate outlets for his military training and natural loyalty if he had been guided by leaders whose primary concern was service to others rather than validation of their own grandiose self-image. The robberies and acts of terrorism that Bill authorized served no larger purpose beyond the immediate acquisition of money and supplies, while the casual cruelty that characterized his treatment of victims demonstrated how completely he had internalized Dutch's later attitude toward anyone who stood in the way of his immediate desires or threatened his authority within their criminal organization. Javier Escuella, whose genuine revolutionary background and authentic commitment to political resistance had once provided Dutch with some measure of credibility for his claims about fighting systematic oppression and defending the rights of society's outcasts, found himself trapped by loyalty to someone whose moral corruption had gradually transformed their shared enterprise from principled rebellion into simple criminality, while his continued devotion to Dutch's memory prevented him from developing the kind of independent moral judgment that might have enabled him to recognize the extent to which their original mission had been betrayed by their leader's psychological inability to subordinate his ego to genuine service of others. The activities that Javier pursued after Dutch's disappearance were motivated not by political conviction or strategic thinking, but rather by his desperate need to honor the memory of someone who had provided him with sanctuary and purpose during a period of exile and desperation. The tragedy of Javier's continued loyalty to Dutch's corrupted vision was compounded by his possession of exactly the kind of authentic revolutionary credentials and moral sensitivity that might have enabled him to build something genuinely valuable from the wreckage of their organization. If he had been capable of honest assessment of Dutch's character and acknowledgement of the fundamental flaws in their approach to political resistance and social change, the intelligence and dedication that Javier displayed in service of Dutch's increasingly destructive agenda could have been employed in support of causes that actually served the welfare of oppressed communities. Yet his psychological dependence upon Dutch's validation and his romantic attachment to their shared memories prevented him from developing the kind of independent leadership capability that genuine political progress requires. The young men who died in service of Dutch's grandiose delusions during the final period of their organization's existence were not heroes whose sacrifice advanced any meaningful cause or achieved any lasting benefit for the communities they claimed to represent, but rather victims of a form of ideological manipulation that had convinced them to value abstract loyalty to their leader over practical consideration of whether their activities actually served the purposes they claimed to pursue. The deaths of Lenny Summers, Sean Maguire, and others who possessed intelligence and moral sensitivity that could have contributed to genuine social progress represented not noble martyrdom, but rather tragic waste of potential that served no purpose beyond providing Dutch with the kind of dramatic validation that his damaged psychology required for maintaining its elaborate defense mechanisms. The particular tragedy of these young deaths lay not simply in their waste of individual potential, but in the way they demonstrated how thoroughly Dutch's psychological corruption had infected the moral reasoning of people who possessed authentic idealism and genuine concern for justice, transforming their noble impulses into instruments for advancing the interests of someone whose primary relationship was with his own grandiose self-image rather than with the real human beings whose welfare he claimed to serve. The education and guidance that Dutch had provided for these young followers had systematically undermined their capacity for independent moral judgment, while reinforcing their psychological dependence upon his wisdom and approval, creating exactly the kind of authoritarian dynamic that his revolutionary philosophy had supposedly been designed to oppose. The contrast between the deaths of those who remained loyal to Dutch until the end and the survival of those who possessed sufficient moral clarity and practical wisdom to recognize the extent of his corruption and distance themselves from his increasingly destructive influence reveals the crucial importance of maintaining intellectual honesty and emotional independence, even within relationships, characterized by genuine affection and shared commitment to noble purposes. The gang members who escaped with their lives and their integrity intact were not those who possessed superior loyalty or greater devotion to their shared cause, but rather those whose psychological development had provided them with the tools necessary for recognizing when loyalty to individuals had become incompatible with service to the principles those individuals claimed to represent. The survivors who managed to build legitimate lives after their association with Dutch were not rewarded for their disloyalty or moral cowardice, but rather demonstrated the kind of authentic courage that genuine commitment to justice and human welfare requires. When such commitment comes into conflict with personal attachments and sentimental loyalty to leaders whose behavior has revealed their fundamental unfitness for the authority they claim, the difficult decisions that these survivors made to prioritize truth over comfort and individual welfare over abstract ideology represented exactly the kind of moral maturity that Dutch's authoritarian leadership style had systematically discouraged while claiming to develop character and ethical sophistication in his followers. John Marston's eventual understanding of Dutch's true nature was not achieved through any sudden moment of dramatic revelation, but rather through the slow and often painful process of comparing the noble principles that Dutch had taught him to value against the actual consequences of Dutch's leadership and decision-making. While his experience of building a family and legitimate career provided him with alternative standards for evaluating what constituted genuine service to others, versus elaborate forms of self-serving manipulation disguised as principled leadership. The years that John spent learning to be a husband and father had taught him to recognize the difference between love that demanded sacrifice of one's own immediate gratification for the sake of others' welfare, and the kind of possessive control that prioritized the leader's psychological needs over the genuine interests of those who depended upon his guidance. The ranch that John built at Beecher's Hope represented more than simply an alternative lifestyle or career change, but rather the concrete embodiment of values and priorities that stood in direct opposition to everything that Dutch's later leadership had come to represent as the patient labor and long-term planning that successful farming required, demonstrated exactly the kind of sustained commitment to productive activity and community building that Dutch's grandiose theatricality and compulsive need for dramatic validation had made impossible during the final years of their association. The daily routines of caring for livestock and maintaining property that characterized John's new life provided constant reinforcement for understanding about responsibility and moral maturity that his criminal education had systematically undermined. Arthur Morgan's journal, which John eventually discovered and read with the kind of careful attention that sacred texts receive from devoted believers seeking guidance for their own moral development, provided insights into the psychological and spiritual journey that had transformed Arthur from unquestioning follower into someone capable of independent moral judgment and authentic sacrifice for the welfare of others, while also revealing the depth of Arthur's understanding about Dutch's character and the extent of his corruption during their final months together. The written record of Arthur's transformation served not only as historical documentation of their organization's moral decline, but also as a guide for understanding how individual conscience could eventually triumph over ideological indoctrination when circumstances created the necessary conditions for growth and honest self-reflection. The wisdom that Arthur had achieved during his final months was not the product of formal education or philosophical sophistication, but rather the result of his willingness to trust his own moral instincts and practical observations over the elaborate rationalizations and rhetorical manipulations that Dutch had employed to justify increasingly destructive behavior, while his terminal diagnosis had provided him with the psychological freedom necessary for honest assessment of their situation and his own complicity in activities that violated everything he had been taught to value about human dignity and community solidarity. The courage that Arthur had displayed in helping others escape from their criminal lifestyle represented exactly the kind of genuine leadership that Dutch's authoritarian methods had systematically suppressed while claiming to develop strength and moral conviction in their followers. Charles Smith's perspective on their shared experiences provided perhaps the most balanced and penetrating analysis of Dutch's character and the factors that had contributed to his moral decline, as Charles's cultural background and personal experience with systematic oppression had given him insights into the difference between authentic resistance to injustice and the kind of theatrical rebellion that served primarily to validate the leader's grandiose self-image, while accomplishing nothing positive for the communities it claimed to defend. The practical wisdom and emotional stability that Charles had maintained throughout their association had enabled him to recognize both the genuine grievances that had motivated their early activities and the psychological corruption that had gradually transformed their mission into something indistinguishable from the predatory criminality they had once opposed. The question of whether Charles could have provided more effective leadership if circumstances had allowed him to challenge Dutch's authority during the crucial period when intervention might still have prevented their organization's complete moral collapse remains one of the most troubling aspects of their collective tragedy, as his obvious moral clarity and practical competence suggested that alternative approaches to their shared problems were indeed possible, if the group's psychological dynamics had not made it impossible for anyone to question Dutch's wisdom or authority without being labelled as disloyal or traitorous. The democratic instincts that Dutch claimed to value as essential features of their moral superiority over conventional authoritarian structures were systematically suppressed whenever they produced conclusions that conflicted with his psychological needs or challenged his preferred interpretation of their circumstances. Sadie Adler's transformation from victim to agent of justice represented a different path toward transcending the cycle of violence and moral compromise that had trapped so many members of their organization, as her evolution into a skilled bounty hunter had provided her with legal authority and professional structure for channeling her capacity for violence in service of genuine law enforcement, rather than the elaborate forms of rationalized criminality that had characterized Dutch's approach to fighting systematic oppression. The success that Sadie achieved in building a career that served both her personal need for meaningful activity and society's legitimate interest in controlling criminal behavior demonstrated that former outlaws could indeed find ways to contribute positively to their communities if they were willing to accept the kind of external accountability and legal constraint that Dutch's grandiose self-image had always made psychologically impossible for him to tolerate. The lessons that these survivors had learned from their association with Dutch were not primarily about the specific techniques of criminal activity or the philosophical justifications for resistance to authority, but rather about the fundamental importance of maintaining intellectual honesty and emotional independence, even within relationships characterized by genuine affection and shared commitment to noble purposes. While their successful transitions to legitimate lives provided concrete evidence that the fatalistic assumptions about their limited options and inevitable destruction that Dutch had used to maintain their loyalty were not accurate assessments of their actual circumstances, but rather psychological manipulation designed to prevent them from developing the kind of independent judgment that might threaten his authority. The communities that benefited from the positive contributions of these reformed outlaws were not aware of the complex psychological and moral journey that had been necessary for their transformation from criminals into productive citizens. Yet, their successful integration into legitimate society represented exactly the kind of positive social change that Dutch's revolutionary rhetoric had always claimed to serve, while his actual methods had systematically prevented, through their creation of psychological dependence and moral confusion that made such integration seem impossible or undesirable to those who remained under his influence. The ordinary happiness and legitimate achievement that these survivors eventually attained was not the result of superior virtue or exceptional luck, but rather the natural consequence of their willingness to prioritize truth over loyalty when the two came into irreconcilable conflict. The eternal questions that Dutch van der Linde's story continues to raise about the nature of leadership and moral authority cannot be answered through simple analysis of his individual psychology or specific historical circumstances, but rather require sustained reflection on the broader patterns of human behavior and social organization that make such corruption possible, while providing the institutional and cultural mechanisms necessary for preventing or minimizing destructive conséquences. The responsibility that followers bear for maintaining critical evaluation of their leaders' decisions and moral character is not diminished by their genuine affection or legitimate gratitude for past benefits, while the tendency to prioritize personal loyalty over ethical principle represents exactly the kind of moral weakness that unscrupulous leaders have always exploited for their own purposes. The danger that charismatic individuals pose to democratic institutions and moral reasoning is not simply a matter of their conscious manipulation or deliberate evil, but rather emerges from the psychological dynamics that develop when followers abandon their responsibility for independent judgment in favor of the psychological comfort that comes from deferring difficult decisions to someone whose confidence and apparent wisdom seems to offer relief from the burden of moral complexity and uncertainty. The corruption of power that Dutch experienced was facilitated not only by his own character defects and psychological needs, but also by the willingness of his followers to accept his authority without the kind of sustained questioning and critical evaluation that effective accountability requires. The timeless relevance of Dutch van der Linde's story as a warning about the corruption of idealism and the dangers of unquestioned loyalty extends far beyond the specific historical context of American frontier criminality to encompass fundamental questions about human nature and social organization that remain as pressing today as they were during the period when Dutch's grandiose delusions about revolutionary leadership were destroying the lives of those who trusted him most completely. The mechanisms of psychological manipulation and ideological control that Dutch employed are not unique to criminal organizations or historical periods, but rather represent universal patterns of human behavior that emerge whenever individuals with certain personality traits are placed in positions of authority over others whose psychological needs or circumstances make them vulnerable to exploitation. And so concludes the tragedy of Dutch van der Linde, a man who dreamed of freedom but created only chains, who spoke of family but destroyed those who loved him most, who preached against corruption while becoming the very evil he claimed to oppose, whose silver tongue could inspire devotion unto death, yet whose golden vision became tarnished beyond recognition by the corrosive touch of pride, paranoia, and the fundamental inability to see past his own reflection in the trusting eyes of those who believed his promises about nobility and revolution, until the bitter end when such belief could only be maintained through willful blindness to evidence that had been accumulating for years, like snow, upon a mountain that would eventually cascade into the avalanche of destruction that buried everything he had spent decades building. His story reminds us that the most dangerous tyrants are often those who convince themselves they are liberators, that the sweetest poison is that which tastes like medicine to those who drink it willingly, and that the road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions, left unexamined and unchecked by the kind of intellectual honesty and moral humility that genuine service to others requires from those who would claim authority over the lives and destinies of their fellow human beings. The philosophical sophistication and rhetorical brilliance that Dutch possessed in such abundance could have been employed in service of causes that actually advanced human welfare and social justice. Yet his psychological need for validation and historical significance made it impossible for him to subordinate his ego to the genuine requirements of effective leadership that must always prioritize the welfare of followers over the gratification of leaders. The campfire that once gathered his chosen family around its warming light has long since burned down to cold ashes scattered by winds that carry no memory of the dreams and aspirations that were once shared in its flickering glow, while the wilderness that sheltered their alternative community has reclaimed the clearings where Dutch once held court and dispensed wisdom that seemed so profound to young minds hungry for purpose and belonging in a world that offered little comfort or security to those who had been abandoned by conventional society and its institutions. The graves that mark the resting places of those who died, believing in his vision, serve as monuments, not to heroic sacrifice, but to the tragic waste of human potential that occurs when noble impulses are corrupted by leaders whose Relationship with truth has been compromised by their desperate need to maintain grandiose self-images that bear no meaningful connection to their actual accomplishments or character. The echoes of Dutch's voice that still reverberate through the memories of those who survived their association with him carry not the inspiration and wisdom that he always claimed to offer, but rather the cautionary reminder that charismatic authority and philosophical sophistication are no guarantee of moral integrity or practical wisdom, while the patterns of manipulation and psychological control that he employed with such devastating effectiveness continue to manifest themselves in contexts far removed from frontier criminality, wherever individuals with certain personality traits encounter circumstances that enable them to exploit the vulnerabilities and dependencies of others who seek guidance and purpose from sources outside themselves. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you not Dutch's words of false wisdom, but the harder truth his life teaches, that true leadership requires the humility to admit error, the courage to change course when wrong, and the wisdom to step aside when one's time has passed. While authentic loyalty demands the intellectual honesty to question those we love when their actions contradict the principles they claim to represent, and the moral courage to choose truth over comfort when circumstances force us to confront uncomfortable realities about human nature and our own complicity in systems of harm that we had previously convinced ourselves were expressions of justice and righteousness. The stars that wheel overhead in their eternal patterns have witnessed countless such tragedies throughout the long history of human ambition and moral failure, yet they continue to shine with the same steady light that guided travelers long before Dutch van der Linde was born, and will continue to illumine the paths of future generations long after his name has been forgotten by all but those who study the darker chapters of human psychology and social organization. The night wind that rustles through the trees carries with it the whispered prayers of those who died, believing in visions that existed only in the minds of leaders who could never see past their own needs for significance and control. While the silence that follows speaks of peace that can only be found through acceptance of our own limitations and commitment to purposes larger than our individual desires for recognition and historical importance. The age of Dutch van der Linde has ended, consumed by the very contradictions and psychological weaknesses that made it possible in the first place. Yet the age of whatever grows from understanding his failures continues to unfold in ways that no single mind could envision, and no individual will could control, spreading through dimensions of time and influence that extend far beyond the boundaries of any particular story or the limitations of any specific historical moment. The lessons embedded in his tragedy are written not in the grandiose rhetoric he favored, but in the concrete consequences of his choices for real human beings who trusted him with their lives and futures, creating a form of moral education that transcends the specific circumstances of frontier outlawry to address eternal questions about power, responsibility, and the price that others pay when leaders prioritize their psychological comfort over genuine service to those they claim to guide and protect. The campfire grows cold now, the last embers fading like Dutch's corrupted dreams of revolution and nobility, and in the silence that follows, we hear not the echo of his grandiose speeches, but the whispered wisdom of those who learned too late to distinguish between authentic leadership and elaborate forms of self-serving manipulation, between genuine loyalty and psychological dependence, between noble idealism and grandiose fantasy that serves primarily to validate the leader's damaged sense of self while accomplishing nothing positive for the communities it claims to defend and liberate from oppression.